Chapter 550. The previous chapter misspelled the 5th and 6th bureau. Apologies here. Also, allow me to sigh sorrowfully. I am truly tired. In one night many people died. The news was like the first frost in early autumn. It immediately deflated the spirits of the conspirators and followers, who had come in high spirits. After the civil officials' battle to the death in Taiji Palace, the deaths that followed in the dark finally made these people understand that there was no such thing as a gentle end to a battle that involved the state. Furthermore, Sir Fan Jr. held the posthumous edict in his hand and had the Overwatch Council's black water under his feet. As long as such a person was not captured, no one could think of living their days of glory and wealth. The Empress Dowager and Crown Prince in the palace understood that this was the attitude Fan Xian, who was hidden in the darkness, was expressing to them. Faced with this attitude, the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince were unusually angry. This attitude was the same as Fan Xian standing in front of them and saying, "I have the power to kill anyone I want to kill. I am threatening you." This was a very immoral method of terrorism. It was threatening the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince to temporarily not act rashly, not touch the Fan family, and not touch the dozens of officials in the celestial prison. Otherwise, if they truly acted rashly, who could kill who? From a certain point of view, Fan Xian's method of intensifying the conflict was very likely a stupid choice. How could the people in the palace be threatened by an official? If the Empress Dowager truly wanted to play a game where both sides suffered and led troops into the capital, what could Fan Xian do? The Overwatch Council could only use its magic in the darkness. Once it encountered a truly powerful army, it could only retreat. For some reason, the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince temporarily chose to be silent and did not carry out their most powerful counterattack. In the following 2 days, the eldest princess's faction gathered together and continued to search the streets and alleys of Jingdo for traces of Fan Xian. Such a powerful force of action. In the end, they only destroyed a few of the Overwatch Council's spies and killed 7 swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. They still did not capture Fan Xian. The Jingdo government and part of the garrison stationed in the city immediately surrounded the Yin Manor. After killing their way into the manor, they only captured a few servants in the manor and did not capture Yin Ruahai. They didn't even see the shadow of Lady Shun, much less Sir Yin Jr., who had helped Fan Xian secretly contact the old Overwatch Council members in Jingdo. The army had yet to enter the capital. The other side could only surround the square building by Tianhe Avenue from a distance and monitor it. They did not dare or have the ability to kill their way into the headquarters of the Overwatch Council. They were only ensuring that Fan Xian and Yin Bingyan had no way of entering the Overwatch Council. The surveillance of King Jing's manor was tightened, but no one dared to lead soldiers into the manor. Everyone was afraid of Fan Xian's eyes hiding in the dark. In just one night, most of the secret agents of the Overwatch Council received secret orders from above and did not return to the Yamen to do their work. They disappeared into the sea of people in Jingdo, hiding their power and protecting their own safety. They returned to the darkness they were most used to. A total of 600 people disappeared just like that. The disappearance of these Overwatch Council officials was the most direct threat to the nobles in the royal palace. There was suddenly no follow-up news from the rumored Crown Prince's ascension ceremony. Although the palace kept a tight watch on the news, how could such a shocking matter continue to be hidden after arresting over 40 officials and throwing them into prison? Gradually, the people of Jingdo began to discover the truth of the matter and knew that a big mess had occurred in the royal palace. The people did not have the power to change history. At least, they did not have the courage right now. They could only be forced to calmly face all of this. They closed their shops, stocked up on enough fine food, and returned to their own homes. Crawling into their blankets, they pressed their palms together and prayed to the heavens to quickly resolve this matter. It didn't matter who became emperor, but there had to be someone to be emperor. The streets of Jingdo appeared unprecedentedly solemn and desolate. Even though there was only a curfew, not many people dared to go out during the day. Originally, according to the eldest princess plan, the Crown Prince, who should have become the new emperor of Qin Kingdom, had already felt waves of unease among the people. The cause of the chaos was only accumulating within Jingdo. Once it spread out of Jingdo and extended to the provinces, then Qing Kingdom would truly fall into chaos. Thus, he had to stabilize all of this in the shortest amount of time. In order to stabilize it, he had to find Fan Xian and kill him. The crown prince looked at the mountainous pile of memorials beside him and smiled bitterly. He couldn't speak for a moment. In just 3 days, the number of memorials that had been submitted by the various provinces of Qing Kingdom had already reached 1,700. Usually, these memorials were taken by a few scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The important matters were given to the emperor to decide, and the small matters were distributed to various departments to deal with. However, the scholars were all in prison, and the officials of various departments had sunk into chaos. Everyone in Jingdo was in a state of panic. The court was gradually unable to move, and government affairs were already in chaos. Taking down the memorials at the top of the small mountain, the crown prince glanced at them. His eyes gradually became confused. These memorials had arrived the latest. Other than Dongshan Road, the other 6 governors had sent the news of the emperor's assassination. Although these governors spoke respectfully, the sordid intent hidden between the lines was very clear. The crown prince sighed and thought helplessly. When did the civil officials of Qing Kingdom become so courageous? He suddenly thought of the dozens of officials in the celestial prison, led by the scholars Hu and Shu, who had endured 2 days and 3 nights in prison, yet not one of them had relented. The palace could not wait any longer. Since yesterday, they had used torture. However, they still had not worn down the officials' bones. He had even heard that starting at noon, Shu the scholar had taken the lead in a hunger strike. The crown prince rubbed his temples and felt a headache coming on. Did he really have to follow his aunt's intentions and kill all these officials? But what if he killed them all? Who would handle court affairs? Did he really want to be a loner? Eunuch Ho suddenly walked into the royal study with a face full of panic without being sent in. The crown prince raised his head and glanced at him. He narrowed his eyes slightly. He knew that Eunuch Ho was his aunt's trusted aide and a trustworthy person. Eunuch Ho moved closer to his ear and said a few words. His face was slightly pale. The crown prince suddenly jumped and slammed his palm on the desk, sending the memorials to the ground. Gritting his teeth, he said darkly, "The 3rd prince has been assassinated. Who gave you the guts to do so?" Eunuch Ho's body shook. He hurriedly lowered his body and said sorrowfully, "It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with me." Unrelated. The crown prince stared coldly into his eyes. "Right now, you are in charge of the palace. Without your hand, how could an assassin have run to the Qin corridor? It really has nothing to do with this servant." Eunuch Ho quickly begged for mercy and said in a low voice. The crown prince only calmed his angry emotions a moment later. With a wave of his sleeve, he walked toward the back of the palace. Yes, he wanted to be the emperor. He wanted to kill Fan Xian. He knew that his 3rd brother was Fan Xian's student and the greatest enemy of his throne. But he still had not thought of killing the 3rd prince. In his eyes, the 3rd prince was still a child. If something really did happen to the 3rd prince, who knew how crazy the already chaotic royal palace in Jingdo would become? As he walked towards the back of the palace, the crown prince's face was ashen as he thought to himself, who was it that wanted to kill my 3rd brother? Was his aunt using his 3rd son's death to force him to be even more ruthless? Did 2nd brother use 3rd brother's death to intensify the conflict between him and the world? However, he knew that no matter what, old 3rd couldn't die. The crown prince prayed in his heart. Li Qingping was the 3rd prince. His life and death had a great effect, so he had to be careful. However, the officials in Jingdo did not have such good treatment. Putting aside the important officials who were currently locked up in the celestial prison by the internal court and suffering torture, some of the officials who still persisted in working in the 6 ministries were also living wretched lives. There were no officials in the Hall of Governmental Affairs working, but the officials of the 6 ministries were still working hard to maintain the operation of the country. Although the memorials the crown prince temporarily approved in the palace had not gone through the royal seal, most of the officials tacitly acknowledged the crown prince's authority. The Minister of Revenue Fan Jian was hiding in King Jing's manor. The Minister of Appointments, Yen Hangshu, was busy arranging new officials into the various ministries to lay the foundation for the Crown Prince's ascension. The other 4 ministries were handling official affairs in a state of panic. As for the officials whose positions were not stable, or who had innate problems, they had already been ostracized. The people who had the deepest connections to Fan Xian's faction had been cleanly stripped of their official positions and detained in a prison to await trial. The celestial prison could no longer hold them. It had been filled by the loyal followers Fan Xian's father-in-law had left behind. Minister Fan's connections in court were rather secretive and had not been completely dug out by the eldest princess. Fan Xian himself did not have much help in court. Logically speaking, it should not be a big problem. Even the 4 disciples of Fan Xian's that everyone knew, Ho Jicheng still shouldered a dangerous life and was watching the movements of the navy in Jiaozhou. He secretly communicated with Su Maokai and was ready to act at any moment. Cheng Jialin had been arranged by Fan Xian in Suzhou to control the palace treasury with Su Wenmao. Yang Wanli had already been building the dikes in the south for a year. Shi Chanli should be in the Song Kingdom, continuing his journey as the greatest pimp in the world. Even if the eldest princess wanted to act against Fan Xian's 4 students, with the current situation in Jingdou unsettled, the crown prince unable to ascend to the throne, and the attitudes of the governors of the 6 roads unclear, she could not extend her hand that far. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of autumn, just after the summer floods. After the water transport governor's yamen finished building the dikes, as usual, they had to send someone back to the capital to ask for silver. This year, the person sent back to the capital to ask for silver was none other than Yang Wanli. He had been placed by Fan Xian into the clear water department of officials. He had done his best in the matter of repairing the dikes, and had been praised by everyone in the water transport yamen. Additionally, they knew of his family connection to the Minister of Revenue, so they naturally sent him back to the capital. They had thought it would be an easy matter for Yang Wanli to return to the capital and ask for silver from the court. Unexpectedly, the emperor had been assassinated and Yang Wanli's teacher, Fan Xian, had been accused of plotting to assassinate the emperor. Thus, the moment Yang Wanli entered the Ministry of Works, he asked for himself. He had already been locked up in a dark room in a side alley for 2 days. During these 2 days, he had been tortured countless times. His body was covered in wounds. However, the people from the Ministry of Justice were unable to pry open his mouth and obtain a confession regarding Fan Xian. Of course, Yang Wanli was innocent. He did not believe that his teacher would do such an evil thing that angered both man and God. Furthermore, he had no way of knowing where Fan Xian was. At dusk, the internal court sent someone to detain him. Although his rank was far from enough to enjoy the celestial prison, the Empress Dowager gave him this honor on account of his teacher-student relationship with Fan Xian. Yang Wanli narrowed his blurry eyes and held his waist like an old farmer as he walked out of the dark room. He felt that there was not a place on his body that did not hurt. The bloody scabs on his fingers had healed and broken, and were beginning to seep blood again. His heart was filled with despair. He knew that once he was taken into the celestial prison, it would probably be difficult for him to see the light of day again. 2 internal court guards held him and cursed as they walked outside. Along the way, the officials from the Ministry of Works saw this wretched sight, but did not dare to look. They only turned their heads and pretended not to see. The officials all knew what had happened in Taiji Palace 2 days ago, so they were not at all surprised by the palace's bloody and ruthless punishment. If the crown prince wanted to ascend to the throne, he had to have these officials lower their heads and submit. Until the last step, the crown prince was unwilling to kill all of the officials. However, in 2 more days, the crown prince could not wait any longer. Walking out of the Ministry of Works yamen and onto the prison carriage, they passed a corner of the street. The prison carriage suddenly stopped. A guard furrowed his brows and stretched his head out to look. His head had just poked out the curtain of the carriage when it fell down with a thud. His entire head fell down. Looking at the headless body in front of him, and the fresh blood gushing out of the cavity, Yang Wanli's face suddenly paled. His empty stomach was uncomfortable. Acid rose up and made him want to vomit. The other guard beside him was shocked and wanted to call for help, but a metal rod pierced into the outside of the carriage sealed his voice. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, revealing Fan Xian's always calm and handsome face. Fan Xian looked at the still shaking Yang Wanli and smiled. "Do you want to come out?" Yang Wanli's tears flowed freely. He looked at his teacher and nodded repeatedly. In a trembling voice he said, "Teacher, it is too risky. Wanli is not worth it." Fan Xian didn't have the patience to listen anymore. He pulled him down and climbed into the Overwatch Council's special carriage. In a moment, they had disappeared into the quiet streets of Jingdo and arrived at a secret meeting point. "Recuperate. I didn't come to save you. I was just passing by." Fan Xian looked at the heavily injured Yang Wanli and sighed. "Of course, if you actually died, I would probably feel sad for a while." Fan Xian was not being pretentious. He was indeed passing by the Ministry of Works Yamen. His destination was even further. That was why he had come to this secret meeting point. Looking at Yin Bingyan in front of him, he asked, "Has it all been confirmed?" The eldest princess, Empress Dowager, Crown Prince, and Lady Shu are all in the palace. Yin Bingyan looked at him and said, "All confirmed. As long as the royal palace is under control, everything will be settled." "Does the Empress Dowager really trust the great prince that much?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows. "If I were her, I would have long swapped the great prince with someone from the old Qin family. Perhaps the Empress Dowager thinks that no one can save Lady Ning under the combined watch of the internal court eunuchs and guards." "I can," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "Tonight, I will rescue all of my relatives and lock up the others." Yin Bingyan smiled, but his smile was a bit bitter. Fan Xian saw the unnaturalness in his expression and furrowed his brows. What happened in the palace? Or did something happen on Sir Yan's side? "Don't worry about father. He's probably in the Qin family right now," Yin Bingyan said with his head lowered. "There is something I should tell you before you enter the palace." Fan Xian looked at him. "The third prince has been attacked by an assassin." Yin Bingyan raised his head to look at him. "You didn't give me your channels in the palace, so I have no way of investigating the results of this assassination. However, I urge you to think of the worst. After all, he is only a child. Iguipin doesn't have much power to protect him." "You're saying that Qingping was attacked by an assassin?" Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak for a long time. However, he gradually tightened his fist. His knuckles turned white and green, revealing the true feelings in his heart. A moment later he said in a heavy voice, "It wasn't the crown prince." Yin Bingyan glanced at him and was slightly surprised. He didn't understand why he was so sure that the mastermind of the assassination in the palace this time was not the crown prince. "Blood has already been seen." Fan Xian raised his head to look at him. "The original plan to enter the palace tonight doesn't need to be brought forward. Follow the original plan." With the help of the Jingdo government, the Black Knights have scattered into the capital. There are 400 people in total. Yin Bingyan knew Fan Xian's current mood, so he didn't misunderstand his particularly cold expression. Instead, he calmly said, "Since you've already decided to give up on the city gate department, then tonight's operation in the royal palace must be completed in one fell swoop. Not a single one can be missed. Of the 9 city gates, which one can I control?" Fan Xian forced a smile. "I don't have enough soldiers at hand, so I can't face them head-on. I can only take risks. Of course, I trust that neither the Empress Dowager nor the eldest princess would think that I would dare to force my way into the palace." He stood and smiled slightly. People who are used to the schemes of emperors often forget such a thing as courage. A drunkard may not have a clear mind, but when holding a kitchen knife, it is still very powerful. "Everyone says my mother-in-law is crazy. I want to know if my forceful attack, without any sense of beauty, will make her so angry she'll curse." "This isn't a forceful attack," Yin Bingyan said. "At least, the Imperial Army won't stop you. However, we only have 400 people. The other people of the 7th Bureau must set up a diversion outside the palace. The royal palace is so big, and we don't have enough people. If we want to guarantee that everyone will be captured, we must know exactly where the targets are." He looked at Fan Xian and said with slight worry, Charging straight into the camp is a great taboo in the art of war. The meaning of gambling is too heavy. I don't know where your confidence comes from. I have people in the enemy camp, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. He then touched his smooth cheek. After learning of the third prince's assassination attempt, he hadn't said a word to Yin Bingyan about the matter. He only calmly arranged for the night's attack. In the end, Fan Xian couldn't resist slowly lowering his head. A wave of sadness rose in his chest. He silently prayed that nothing would happen to Qingping. You can't die. Fan Xian seemed to be saying this to himself, and also to the third prince, whose life and death he didn't know. You are going to be the emperor in the future. Let us bring forward the time by 2 hours to see a palace murder that could change history and many people. After the assassination attempt on the Qing emperor on Dong Mountain, this was the second major event that shook the palace. The target of this assassination attempt was the third prince. The third prince was Li Qingping. His mother was Yi Guipin from Duke Lu's family. He had once followed the Duke of Dongbua, Fan Xian, to study in Jiangnan for a year. Furthermore, he was the successor to the throne that Fan Xian had openly supported this year. Until a long time later, no one knew the main culprit in this murder attempt. No matter how one looked at it, the third prince could not be considered an important target. Although everyone knew that this 10-year-old boy had a great influence on the crown prince's right of succession, this influence was mainly because of Fan Xian's support. The third prince himself did not have any extraordinary magic or powerful power. Even if the crown prince was worried that his little brother would cause trouble, he would only think of killing Fan Xian, and not the third prince. The third prince's death would not benefit the crown prince at all, other than making the opposition of the court officials a little fiercer, and making Fan Xian's rebellion a little crazier. Most importantly, with Fan Xian as the scapegoat, the Dong Mountain matter could forever be hidden behind the truth. If Li Qingping died in the royal palace, how would the present master of the royal palace, the crown prince, convince this little girl in history? The crown prince was like his father. They were both people who cared deeply about their reputation in history. Thus, he would waver between killing or not killing officials. Thus, he would not order his subordinates to kill the third prince. This was also why Fan Xian determined that the main culprit was not him. Then, who wanted to kill Li Qingping? In the Cheng corridor of the royal palace, the young Li Qingping's face was full of shock. He ran wildly as he also thought of this question. Unfortunately, this was not Hongguang Palace. The Empress Dowager had no way to protect his life. He called for help, but the Cheng corridor was too quiet. No one heard his cry for help. Li Qingping felt hopeless. He thought that if he had stayed obediently in Hongguang Palace, he would certainly not have died. He shouldn't have fallen for the trick earlier and run to the Cheng corridor. However, the other party had said that his teacher had something to tell him and had shown him a keepsake. Thus, he had fallen for the trick and secretly hid it from his mother and the eunuchs and serving girls in Hongguang Palace to come to the Cheng corridor alone. Run as fast as you can, child. How could a child outrun an adult? Panting, Li Qingping fell to the ground. Looking at the two eunuchs closing in on him step by step, his face was deathly pale. He gritted his teeth forcefully. These two eunuchs were not martial artists, but it was clear that they had received some kind of training to kill. Against a child without the strength to truss a chicken, it was too easy. It was so easy that the two eunuchs already treated Li Qingping as a dead person. One foot stepped on him to the ground, and one hand reached into their clothes to take out a knife. Chapter 551. The next update will be on the 20th or 21st. I am truly sorry because I am about to embark on my journey home, and the journey will take 3 days and 2 nights. Our great motherland is truly too big, vast. Sometimes it is truly a kind of torture. With a ding, the knife in the eunuch's hand brushed past the third prince's small body and stabbed ruthlessly into the stone floor below the Cheng corridor. It actually sent up a few pieces of stone. It was clear how powerful the force was. The third prince twisted his body and screamed wildly. His feet kicked blindly and just happened to dodge the knife. The dagger in his trembling hand waved wildly a few times. With 2 slashing sounds, the lower robes of the 2 eunuchs were cut open, revealing 2 holes. The eunuchs' faces were cold. It seemed that they had not thought that a noble prince would carry a dagger at all times, and that this dagger would be so sharp. The dagger he pulled out of his boot for the first time did not seem to be as effective as it should have been. Although the dagger was sharp, it was held in the hands of a 12-year-old boy. In this moment of life and death, Li Qingping learned the murderous courage Fan Xian had when he was 12, but he did not learn his teacher's ability to kill. Although the murderous eunuchs did not have any martial arts skills, their bodies were strong. How could he resist? One eunuch stepped firmly on Li Qingping to the ground. The other stepped on Li Qingping's elbow, making it impossible for him to move. Looking at the holes in his clothes, he shook his head. With one hand around Li Qingping's neck and the other holding the knife, he stabbed down again. Li Qingping's breathing became more and more difficult. He watched as the knife stabbed down. He knew he was going to die. He couldn't help but feel endless regret. He thought to himself that the knife he had just swung out hadn't even grazed the other person's side. In his despair, he couldn't help but give up. He closed his eyes and cried. He waited for a long time. Li Qingping could even feel the pain of a sharp object stabbing into his chest. The metal hand on his neck was cutting off his breathing. However, he found that he was still alive. The 2 feet on his body and hands did not seem to be stepping down with any more force. He opened his eyes in horror and saw a scene that terrified him. He saw that the 2 eunuchs above him were just like him. Their eyes were wide open in horror, and 2 streams of black blood flowed from the corners of their eyes. Li Qingping knew that his chance of survival had come again. Yelling wildly, he pulled his right hand out from under the eunuch's foot and ruthlessly stabbed the knife into the calf that was stepping on his chest. The dagger pierced his flesh and blood blossomed. Li Qingping struggled to his feet. He watched as the 2 eunuchs, who had been so fierce earlier, fell down like 2 pieces of wood. He couldn't help but feel a wave of fear. His legs were trembling, and he didn't dare to go forward to see what was going on. Why did the 2 imperial supervisory officers collapse with black blood flowing from the corners of their eyes? He lowered his head and looked at the knife in his chest. Only then did he feel the endless pain, and he cried out in pain. Fortunately, by the time the eunuch stabbed down, he had already breathed his last, and could not continue to exert force. The tip of the knife had only sunk a third into his flesh. Only then did Li Qingping manage to save his life. Li Qingping dragged his limp legs and walked to the side of the 2 eunuchs who had already died. Other than fear, there was also endless doubt in his heart. He wondered if the heavens were helping him and casting a curse on these 2 eunuchs. It wasn't a curse. The 3rd prince, who had woken up, finally understood. He stared in a daze at the 2 holes in the clothes of the 2 eunuchs. He then lowered his head to glance at the black dagger in his hand. The dagger in his hand was too sharp. Although he had only randomly swung it a few times earlier, it had not only cut through the eunuch's clothes, but it had also grazed the skin under their clothes. However, because the dagger was too sharp, or perhaps the teacher had smeared some medicine on the dagger, the 2 eunuchs did not feel anything. The dagger was imbued with the Overwatch Council's most powerful poison. Once the blade broke through the skin, the medicine entered the blood. It only took a moment for the 2 eunuchs to be poisoned to death. They didn't even have the time to kill. What a powerful poison! Li Qingping, who had narrowly escaped death, trembled all over. He held the dagger tightly in his hand and looked at the 2 eunuchs at his feet, whose faces were gradually turning black. Finally, he could no longer stand and fell to the ground. He knew that if it wasn't for the fact that there was such a powerful poison on the dagger, if it wasn't for the fact that the 2 eunuchs had not thought of this, then no matter how he struggled, he would not have been able to escape death. His entire body trembled as he sat beside the 2 bodies. His face was deathly white. He didn't know what he should do next. This was the first time he had been killed. Even though he was a powerful prince who matured early, he was still shocked to the point that his state of mind was thrown into chaos. After sitting for an indeterminable amount of time, the 12-year-old Li Qingping finally came to his senses and climbed up with some difficulty. Looking at the 2 bodies beside him, a complicated emotion that a child should not have appeared in his eyes. This emotion was fear, helplessness, sadness, and a glimmer of excitement. It gradually turned into calmness and anger. Calm anger. Who wanted to kill him? Li Qingping didn't know, but he knew that it had to do with his brothers. He suddenly let out a cry. Then, he tightened his grip on the dagger by his hand and stabbed it down forcefully. 1 stab, 2 stab, 3 stab. He numbly and mechanically stabbed the dagger into the body of the eunuch beside him. Countless amounts of fresh blood sprayed out. In the end, the fresh blood splashed into black blood. He hated these people, so he wanted them to die completely. Of course, he would be very careful not to let the blood poison touch his body. After a while he stopped crying out of fear. Holding onto the pillar in the corridor, he stood up. Looking at the quiet and empty long path in the Qin corridor, his lips trembled slightly. Then he called out in a loud voice. At the end of the Qin corridor was the cold palace. There were always serving girls in the cold palace. Mother, I don't want you to live in the cold palace. The early autumn weather was not cold. In a side room at the back of Hongguang Palace, the third prince was tightly wrapped in a large blanket. Looking at Yi Guipin, who was looking at him with tears in her eyes, he lowered his voice and said in a firm and cold tone, I don't want to die. You can't die either. Yi Guipin's eyes were red. She held him tightly. Earlier, the cold palace had come to report. Only now did everyone know that the third prince had sneaked out of Hongguang Palace and had encountered assassins deep in the palace. In her anger, the Empress Dowager ordered the inner palace to strengthen its defenses. Not only did she capture the assassins, she also angrily reprimanded the eunuchs and serving girls in Hongguang Palace. Even Yi Guipin was not spared. Earlier, the Empress Dowager had stayed by the unconscious third prince's bedside for a while before leaving. After the Empress Dowager left, Li Qingping woke up and spoke to his mother in a trembling voice. It was clear that he had pretended to be unconscious in front of the Empress Dowager. This third prince only had a secret fear of the Empress Dowager and didn't want to face his grandmother. Don't worry. Yi Guipin held her son. Her shock had not yet faded. She said in a trembling voice. In Hongguang Palace, with the Empress Dowager watching, they won't dare to act rashly again. Li Qingping's expression darkened. He knew his mother was only comforting him, but he didn't say anything. Yi Guipin lowered her head to look at her son. She wanted to speak but stopped. In the end, she couldn't resist asking in a quiet voice. Those 2 eunuchs, how did they die? Whose people did they belong to? I don't know. Li Qingping didn't explain the matter of the dagger. At the same time he had called for help, he had already hidden the dagger in the trees beside the Qin corridor. There was a glimmer of terror in his eyes. Looking at his mother, he said, suddenly dying, I don't know who wanted to kill me. Yi Guipin fell silent and glanced around. She found that there were too many people and too many eunuchs and serving girls waiting outside the side room. It was indeed not convenient to say too much, so she hesitantly closed her mouth. Ever since they learned of the emperor's assassination, she and the third prince had been under house arrest in Hongguang Palace. They didn't know what had happened outside. They only knew that Fan Xian had been made a criminal, and that the Fan and Lu families were both under the control of the internal court. The Empress Dowager's gaze toward her grew colder and colder. Looking at this palace, Yi Guipin felt a bone-chilling coldness. She thought to herself, this Hongguang Palace doesn't seem to be very safe. A middle-aged woman walked in from outside the room. It was the great prince's birth mother, Ning the Talented. Yi Guipin quickly stood and bowed. The 2 mothers met each other's eyes and sighed endlessly. The crown prince had also come to visit and comforted his brother. He also promised that he would find out who the true killer was. These words were said with great sincerity, but Yi Guipin didn't hear them. It wasn't until night gradually fell, the people gradually left, and the room gradually became quiet that Yi Guipin looked at her son hidden under the blankets and faintly said, if it wasn't the crown prince, who could it be? The third prince had been stabbed to death. For the various powers in Jingdo, who would benefit the most? Yi Guipin involuntarily thought of a person's name, but didn't dare say it. Li Qingping looked at his mother's thoughtful expression and felt a chill in his heart. He knew who his mother was suspecting. Resolutely, he shook his head and said, it wasn't my teacher. Yi Guipin was suspecting Fan Xian, because there was a large group of civil officials standing firmly by Fan Xian's side. They were using the so-called posthumous edict and the name of righteousness to attack the crown prince. If the third prince had truly died in the royal palace, the crown prince would not be able to clear his name no matter what. In terms of public opinion, he would be at a disadvantage. Furthermore, if Fan Xian truly had the confidence to defeat the crown prince, then what was the point of keeping the third prince alive? Iguipin looked at her son and faintly said, "Although he is your teacher, he is, after all, not your real cousin. He is my real brother." The third prince bit his lip and said. Iguipin sighed. In this royal family, where is there such a thing as brotherhood, teacher and disciple? Earlier, you didn't tell the Empress Dowager and Crown Prince that those two eunuchs used a keepsake to trick you into going to the Qin corridor. If they weren't your teacher's people, how could they have a keepsake? The keepsake was actually very simple. It was just a page from one of the third prince's favorite books in the Peng Manor, by Westlake in Jiangnan. Li Qingping lowered his head. I won't suspect teacher. Furthermore, I believe in his abilities. If he really wanted to kill me and throw the palace into further chaos, he wouldn't use the keepsake. These are all places where it's easy to reveal flaws. As for Master, he would never reveal so many flaws. Iguipin forced a smile and didn't say anything more. Looking at her emotions and the current dangerous situation, she was willing to believe her son's judgment of Fan Xian. Other than Fan Xian, she and her son had no one else to rely on. Yes, but I don't know when Sir Fan Jr. will be able to rescue us, Iguipin thought to herself. Iguipin thought that if Fan Xian truly forced the crown prince into a situation where he could not retreat, the crown prince could only risk the condemnation of the world and use bloody methods to subdue the hearts of the officials. At that time, she and her son would probably not be able to survive. In the front of Hongguang Palace, everyone was silent. The entire palace was enveloped in an oppressive and tense atmosphere. The crown prince and empress sat on either side of the Empress Dowager and gently massaged the old woman's back. This mother and son situation was much more relaxed than Iguipin's. They also knew that nothing could happen to this old woman under their fists. Aunt. The empress glanced at the Empress Dowager and timidly said, "The third prince's life is very fortunate." She glanced again. To be able to survive like this, it looks like Fan Xian, that traitor, has taught him many things. The crown prince furrowed his brows and saw the skin on his grandmother's temple tighten slightly. He knew that his mother's words had stupidly angered the Empress Dowager. He huffed coldly and said, "As long as my brother is alive, let's not talk about anything else for now." The Empress Dowager forcefully breathed a few times and suppressed the anger in her heart. She warmly patted the back of the crown prince's hand, thinking that of all the descendants of the royal family, probably only the crown prince truly understood what she was thinking. Thinking of this, the Empress Dowager increasingly felt that her choice was not wrong. Qing Kingdom indeed needed a filial child like the crown prince to manage. "You can all leave." The Empress Dowager coughed. Her mind was particularly tired. She waved her hand. All of the serving eunuchs, serving girls, and old nannies accepted their orders and left. Even the somewhat dissatisfied empress was chased out of the palace. Only she and the crown prince were left in the palace. The Empress Dowager turned around and looked at the crown prince with listless eyes. Holding the crown prince's hand, she faintly said, "I don't want you brothers to kill each other. That is why I am supporting this body and watching all of this. I am very pleased that you understand this." The crown prince did not reply. He only sighed. Perhaps he was thinking of his brother Fan Xian. The Empress Dowager's gaze immediately became cold. It was as if she had seen through the crown prince's heart. As an emperor, you must be decisive and lenient when necessary. As for Fan Xian, he is an evil thief who plotted to assassinate your father. His surname is Fan, not Li. What is the point of thinking so much? The crown prince lowered his head in acceptance. I understand. Some people cannot be let go. It is a pity that we still did not catch him. The Empress Dowager slowly closed her eyes. Where are Xu Wu and the other officials being held? In the Ministry of Justice's prison. The crown prince laughed bitterly. It is not good to place them in the Overwatch Council's celestial prison. However, for some reason, these officials have been deceived by Fan Xian. They are so muddle-headed that they refuse to submit. The Empress Dowager laughed coldly. Deceived? They are just a bunch of pedantic people. Only your father would allow them to be so presumptuous. Perhaps they have already seen the posthumous edict in Fan Xian's hand, which is why they dare to be so stubborn. The Crown Prince's expression changed slightly. He immediately calmed down and said, "There is no posthumous edict." "Correct." The Empress Dowager looked at him with approval. "So, how do you think we should deal with these officials who speak nonsense and threaten the royal family?" The Crown Prince's expression changed again. He knew the Empress Dowager wanted him to make up his mind. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "We will kill them if we need to." "Very good." The Empress Dowager's expression gradually became cold. "If you want to be steady, then don't be afraid of killing." However, the subordinates of the Overwatch Council do not obey the Emperor's orders at all. "It is a bit troublesome," the Crown Prince said after thinking for a while. "Many officials in Jingdo were assassinated today. The people are panicking, and the court is in chaos. Fan Xian is hiding in the dark and managing everything. I can't think of a good way to deal with him. Fan Xian is using blood and heads to intimidate the court officials with the intention of throwing Jingdo into chaos." The Empress Dowager looked at her grandson and quietly said, "What do you want to say? Just say it." The Crown Prince was silent for a moment. He then raised his head and said in a firm tone, "I would like to ask the Empress Dowager to move the army into the capital to suppress it." Hongguang Palace once again quieted down. After a long time, the Empress Dowager slowly said, "Today in Taiji Palace, Yin Hangshu already had this suggestion. How was it rejected in the end?" The Crown Prince laughed bitterly and shook his head. No one thought that after all the scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs were imprisoned, someone else would jump out today. The person who jumped out in court today did not have a high position, but his identity was special. He was the imperial censor of the left of the imperial censorate, He Zhongwei. He Zhongwei had always been on the Eastern Palace's side. Later, he had helped the eldest princess chase Prime Minister Lin Ruofu out of Jingdo. Furthermore, he had always had an unexplainable grudge with the Fan Manor. The Crown Prince had always thought that this person would be a pillar of his court in the future. He had not expected that when he was about to move the army into the capital and issue an edict, this person would jump out to oppose it. He Zhongwei's opposition was extreme. He took off his official robes and took off his black veil. Leading a dozen imperial censors, he knelt in front of Taiji Palace. In a rage, the Crown Prince hit him 12 times and chased him out of the palace. But this once famous scholar in Jingdo knelt in front of the palace walls covered in blood and did not yield a single step. Imperial censor He's opposition is very reasonable, the Empress Dowager said tiredly. The Empress Dowager lowered her eyelids slightly and tiredly said, "Actually, I have never had the Qin family enter the capital because I was worried about this problem. The court's ancestors strictly forbade the military from entering the capital to interfere in politics. Once this precedent is set, I'm afraid there will be endless trouble in the future." The Crown Prince was silent. He understood the Empress Dowager's worries. The Empress Dowager still hoped that he could peacefully take over. Once the military was involved, the Qin and Yi families would grow. He did not have supreme authority in the military like his father. What would the future Qin kingdom become? The Qin family has been loyal for generations. There is no need to worry, the Empress Dowager said coldly. She had a deep relationship with the Qin family, so there was no need to worry about this problem. But what about the Yi family? Yi Zhong is your second brother's father-in-law. The Empress Dowager looked at the silent Crown Prince and took a deep breath. She then sinisterly said, "However, Fan Xian, this shady person's actions are too crazy. If there is no army to suppress him, Jingdo will never be able to stabilize. Even if you kill a dozen officials in prison, what good will it do? If the situation drags on for a few more days, once the morale of the other 5 elite armies of the Qin kingdom becomes unstable, the situation will be worrisome." The Crown Prince bowed silently and said, "Therefore, I need the army to enter the capital. Compared to future troubles, the present Fan Xian is a dagger placed in front of us." He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "However, what about He Zhongwei? After all, he is the imperial censor of the left. He has a group of imperial censors under him, who are famous for not being afraid of death. They are playing a death remonstrance outside the palace walls. The crown prince's worry was not without reason. Killing officials was not rare in history, but killing an imperial censor was a great taboo. Even with the Qing emperor's supreme authority, the Qing emperor had only struck the imperial censors a few times to show his sincerity when they collectively attacked his illegitimate son, Fan Xian. There will always be people who need to be evil. The Empress Dowager stared into the crown prince's eyes and lovingly said, "Let me order these people to be dealt with." The Empress Dowager paused and then said, "After the army enters the capital, you can hand over your brother's position as commander." The crown prince bowed sincerely, moved speechlessly. In Guangxin Palace, not far from Hongguang Palace, the eldest princess, who had made this plan from the beginning, and then began to coldly watch the countless characters act on the stage, finally sank into worry for the first time. The things that had happened today made her feel that something was strange. Why have we still not caught Fan Xian? She looked at Eunuch Ho beside her and asked coldly. It's not that the internal court doesn't have aces. It's not that the Jingdo government hasn't put in effort. How long do I need to wait before I can see his head? She said these words in front of her daughter. Lin Wanna listened with a slight smile at the side. It seemed that she was not worried at all about her husband's safety. A few days had already passed. Since the palace had no way of catching him, then he would never be caught. After chasing Eunuch Ho out of the palace, the eldest princess's expression immediately changed. It was calm. It was impossible to tell that she had been so angry earlier. She knew that Fan Xian would not be so easy to catch. Since this young man was able to return alive from Dong Mountain, it proved his ability. This was a situation that involved the entire world. The focus of the eldest princess's thoughts had always been on Dong Mountain, and not Jingdo. From the beginning, she had not thought that Fan Xian would be able to return to Jingdo alive. This point had already shaken her mind to its core. If Fan Xian lived, then Yin Xiaoyi would die. Li Yunrui lowered her eyelids slightly. The coldness in her eyes was slightly restrained. She thought about Fan Xian's present cultivation. Just what realm had he reached? He dared to so arrogantly and wantonly use assassination methods in Jingdo to challenge the authority of the royal palace. She suddenly furrowed her brows and looked at the cold and cheerless Guangxin Palace. This palace gives off the smell of death. I want to go out. Lin Wanner looked calmly at her mother and said, "You're afraid? What do I have to be afraid of? Afraid that Fan Xian will break into the palace tonight?" The eldest princess gently patted her daughter's slightly thin cheek and said, "I understand Fan Xian too well. He will always be an assassin, and a mouse who plays in the dark. He never has the courage to face his enemies head-on, because he is more afraid of death than anyone else." The eldest princess tilted her head slightly and looked at her daughter. "I've been thinking about a question. If I used your life to threaten him, what would he do? I am very curious about the answer to this question." The eldest princess smiled happily. "That is why I am waiting for Fan Xian to kill his way in front of me." Fan Xian still thought he had seen the Empress Dowager's thoughts clearly. The grandmother of the Li family hoped for a peaceful handover, and did not want the wild and uncontrollable power of the army to turn the entire Qing kingdom into a mess. Thus, he had methodically carried out his arrangements. It was clear that he had underestimated his dark killing god image, and how valiant he was in the hearts of the nobles in the royal palace. He had not thought that his assassination in Jingdo had finally provoked the Empress Dowager and the Crown Prince to a certain degree, forcing them to prepare to move the army into the capital to suppress it. The next day, the Jingdo garrison in the Yuantai camp would enter the capital to suppress it. If Fan Xian had not been able to control the royal palace before then, what awaited him was certain to be a wretched ending. He had also not thought that when the Qin family's army entered the capital, it would be forcefully delayed by a knight by He Zongwei, the servant of the three surnames he had always looked down on and deeply loathed, with a hot-blooded and valiant attitude. In this sense, He Zongwei had done him a great favor. The Empress Dowager and the Crown Prince's determination was clearly a day late. It was a deep and quiet night. The knight fell into a deep sleep. It was time for the imperial army's shift. The imperial army controlled the front half of the palace in the royal palace, as well as a number of important streets outside the royal palace. Presently, the situation was tense. The imperial army on shift were temporarily stationed in the private houses on these streets, not daring to return to the camp to wait for orders. A group of about 200 imperial army soldiers, fully armored, walked with unusual calmness to the main palace doors. They exchanged defensive procedures and orders with the imperial army on shift. Due to the current situation, the commander of the imperial army, the Great Prince, had not returned to his manor for 3 days. He stood on the palace walls and looked coldly at the exchange below. After a slight pause, he slowly walked down. Dressed in armor, he stood in the palace doors like a god, about to block all attacks from outside the royal palace. He looked coldly at this group of 200 imperial army soldiers. A moment later, he silently nodded his head. The trusted officer at his side swallowed and nervously went forward to go through all the procedures. He then waved his hand to allow the group of clearly unfamiliar imperial army soldiers to walk into the royal palace. The Great Prince stood in the palace doors and allowed the imperial army soldiers, who had come to take over, to split into 2 lines and walk past him. This group of imperial army soldiers who had come to take over left silently and with strict military discipline. When the last group of imperial army soldiers were about to walk through the palace doors, the Great Prince suddenly sighed. The person at the back of the imperial army group nodded gently at him. "Commander, what do we do next?" The officer was the Great Prince's trusted aide, and a general who had climbed up from the Western Expedition Army. Logically speaking, it was not his place to personally handle such a small matter as the exchange of guards. However, he knew that he had to handle this exchange of guards himself. Seeing the imperial army soldiers gradually disappear on the thick palace walls, the officer swallowed and forcefully suppressed the fear in his heart. He asked for instructions in a trembling voice. The Great Prince slowly tightened his grip on the sword at his waist. Facing the night wind, the lines of his face appeared particularly hard. "Have everyone wake up. An emergency military meeting." The moment he said this, a thick killing intent appeared around him. Although the Great Prince was not a martial expert, he had fought on the battlefield all year round. Countless souls had died under his sword. Since he had made up his mind tonight, the first thing he had to do was take care of the restless factor within the imperial army. The officer knew that the commander was going to kill tonight. The trusted aides of Yin Xiaoyi's faction in the imperial army were probably going to be completely slaughtered. However, he was no longer afraid. Boundless excitement rose from the bottom of his heart. He immediately began to pass on the orders. The front wall of the imperial palace was extremely wide, and 4 horses could run side by side on it. It was completely made of green bricks, and naturally exuded an austere aura. A row of imperial guards was arranged in formation, looking at the square below the imperial city. They were on guard, seemingly ready to receive an attack from outside the imperial palace at any time. However, one of the imperial guards looked into the palace with a profound gaze. Fan Xian gently tidied up the imperial soldier's clothing and looked at the familiar palace. It was pitch black inside. He didn't know where his family was, or where his enemies were. He knew that if he led 200 people into the palace, he would face the internal guards and internal court eunuch aces. No one knew what the chances of success were for such a risk. It was because he could not determine whether the first prince would be able to completely control the imperial guards when the sounds of killing rang out. He could not rely on the strength of the imperial army. Never do what the enemy wants you to do. The reason is very simple, because the enemy wants you to do that. Fan Xian said to Jing Ge, the deputy commander of the Black Knights beside him. That's what a man called Napoleon said. The doors to the royal palace have already opened, but the doors to the rear palace are still closed. They didn't think we would dare to use so few people to attack the royal palace. He still did not know the eldest princess evaluation of him. If this had been the Commissioner Fan of the past, the immortal poet, he would indeed not have chosen such a direct and brave attack. Chapter 552. I had arrived home last night, and was indeed very tired. I raised my hands in a salute. The royal palace was even more thick-skinned than the nobility in Jingdo. One could ride horses up and store goods down. Even the room where the imperial army discussed official business was set up between large pieces of stone. In the darkness there was a sense of sternness. Only a few flickering lights shone on the faces and eyes of everyone in the room, waking them up with a start. These imperial army generals and officers were indeed very tired. Ever since the three riders had returned from the capital and reported what had happened at Dong Mountain, a storm was brewing in Jingdo. The royal palace they were responsible for surrounding and protecting had become the eye of the storm that various powers were watching closely. For a number of days, not a single general could leave the royal palace. Even when it was their turn, no one returned to their manors to rest. The flames in the great prince's eyes became a burning light. He looked faintly at the dozen generals in the room and said in a cold voice, "Did you all hear what I said clearly?" The room was completely silent. A general knelt on one knee with a heavy expression. Gritting his teeth, he said, "I am not sure. You want me to read the posthumous edict again?" The great prince stared into his eyes and said in a cold voice, "The crown prince colluded with northern Qi and Dongyi assassins to assassinate the previous emperor on Dong Mountain, with the intention of usurping the throne. Later he framed Sir Fan Jr. Since I have accepted the previous emperor's posthumous edict, those who deserve to be executed will be executed." The general glanced at the thin piece of paper by the great prince's side and narrowed his eyes. "Your Highness, who knows if the so-called posthumous edict is real or fake?" The great prince looked at him coldly. He then slowly took out a box from his clothes and placed it on the table. The box was opened. Inside was a small seal. It was the emperor's royal seal that had been missing for a number of days, and that the palace's edicts had been unable to comply with. Once the royal seal appeared, the expressions of all the generals in the room changed dramatically. They all knelt on the ground and bowed toward the royal seal. No one dared to say anything more. "We solemnly obey your Highness's military orders. Sir Fan Jr. was ordered to eradicate the rebels and ordered me to help." The great prince's gaze slowly slid across the faces of the generals kneeling on the ground. He saw many people's thoughts. Although he had listened to Fan Xian's advice and placed many trusted aides in the imperial army after leading the imperial army, there were still many remnants of power left behind by Yin Xiaoyi's control of the imperial army. If he wanted to rely on the royal seal and posthumous edict, he would have to make these people wholeheartedly work for him. The corners of the great prince's eyes twitched. He laughed coldly in self-mockery. There had never been such a simple thing in the world. Generals who are willing to follow this king to save the country in this time of crisis, please stand up. The great prince spoke calmly. The light given off by the oil lamps in the corner of the room enveloped his face, making it seem as if blood was seeping out of his face. All of the generals in the room stood up. Their power was greater than the people. At this moment, the room was filled with the great prince's trusted lieutenants. Even if the generals had other thoughts, they did not dare to make things difficult in front of him. The general who had come out to speak tasted bitterness in his mouth. He had long maintained contact with the eldest princess in the palace. He had not thought that the great prince would suddenly make things difficult tonight and gather all of the generals in the secret room for a meeting. Furthermore, the message had been sent so quickly that he did not have a sliver of time to react. All of the generals of the imperial army were in the room. No one was left out. If the great prince chose to kill, no one would be able to resist. Thus, Yin Xiaoyi's former subordinates could only feign civility for now. Zhang Hao Chinijiang. The great prince suddenly opened his mouth and called out the names of 5 generals. The expressions of the 5 generals became cold. They met each other's eyes and felt a glimmer of inauspiciousness. They walked out of the ranks. These 5 were all subordinates that Yin Xiaoyi had promoted when he was still alive. The great prince looked coldly at these 5 people. He paused for a moment and then faintly said, "You all know why I have called you out." A general's face was ashen. With a thud, he knelt before the great prince and said, "Your Highness, I will definitely follow your Highness's lead, and will not have any ulterior motives." The great prince looked at him and nodded. He said warmly, I'll have to trouble you to stay in this room for half a day. How about that? The general's expression changed. In the end, he still nodded and retreated to the wall. The other 4 people felt extremely complicated emotions. If they were guarded by the great prince's personal soldiers in this secret room, how could they send a message to the palace? The 4 of them met each other's eyes. It was still the person who had spoken who spoke. His surname was Jiang. He was a trusted aide that Yin Xiaoyi had personally promoted. He knew that since the great prince had rebelled today, he would not be tolerated no matter what. Furthermore, his identity was set. He could not just wait to be tied down. Jiang was silent for a moment. He then said, "Your Highness, of the 2,000 imperial soldiers on the palace walls, at least 600 or 700 are the subordinates of the 5 of us. May I ask, if you don't have our help, how will you subdue all of the imperial soldiers?" He abruptly raised his head and smiled coldly. The Jingdo garrison can enter the capital at any moment. A third of the imperial army has been moved to Dong Mountain. What can we use to oppose those tigers and wolves? I would like to ask you to reconsider to prevent yourself from losing your life. Although these words were harsh, the silent officers in the room all knew that this was Jiang's final struggle to put on a brave front but weak heart. I never need to think about things that I have already thought about. The great prince looked coldly at Jiang. A murderous intent gradually rose in his eyes. It was a cold murderous intent that had been honed while fighting against the Hu people in the west. Jiang's heart trembled. Hot blood rushed to his head. With an angry roar, his hand gripped the knife at his waist. With a clang, he pulled it out of its sheath and charged toward the great prince. The angry roar stopped in the middle. The knife also fell to the ground. 3 long spears pierced Jiang's body with unusual coldness and brutality, piercing through his body and leaving him suspended in midair. Blood sprayed out of Jiang's mouth. He looked with unwillingness and despair at the great prince 3 feet away. His body twitched a few times on the long spear before he hung his head and died. At the same time that Jiang pulled out his knife and charged over, the other 3 generals Yin Xiaoyi had left behind also pulled out their knives. Bravely and hopelessly they charged over. However, the room was full of the great prince's trusted aides. There were only a few whooshing sounds as the knife flashed a few times under the red light. The bodies fell to the ground. The smell of blood gradually rose. The 4 generals of the imperial army died sullenly. The great prince looked calmly at the bodies at his feet. Suddenly, he turned his head to glance at the last general. He saw that the man's legs were trembling, but did not have the courage to go forward. He couldn't help but shake his head and quietly curse something. "Watch carefully," the great prince ordered his trusted aide. Without turning his head, he walked out of the meeting room. Walking up to the top of the royal palace walls, the great prince stood in a corner tower. His palm gently stroked the city-guarding crossbow that had been locked in place. His gaze followed the large crossbow bolts shining with black light, and looked toward the square outside the royal palace, as well as the 4 streets outside the square already controlled by the imperial army. Following the commander's orders, those 600 people are all on duty and resting. The officer who had personally arranged for Fan Xian to lead the group into the palace stood behind the great prince and reported in a low voice. After using a day and a half's time to tamper with the imperial army's rotation, the great prince finally succeeded in moving the 600 or so imperial army soldiers out of the royal palace without alerting the 4 generals who had already died. The great prince faintly said, "Are you ready?" The officer raised his head and glanced at the great prince. Resolutely he reported, 1,200 people have already surrounded them. We can move at any time. At this moment, there were already 1,200 subordinates loyal to the first prince in the resting area of the imperial guards. They had snuck in through the night and surrounded the 600 soldiers. With one order, they would raise the butcher's knife and clean out the last of the unstable elements in the imperial army. Those soldiers should still be sleeping. The great prince's expression was complicated. Dying in their sleep should be pretty good. Back then, the great prince had personally led tens of thousands of troops on an expedition to the west and achieved great feats by the side of Shihu. What was most praised about him, as well as his virtue of having the soldiers die for him, was that he always loved his soldiers like they were his children. However, kindness did not lead an army, particularly when it came to matters concerning the future of the Qing kingdom. The great prince's heart was like stone. We await the commander's orders. The trusted aide did not know what the great prince was thinking and felt a bit anxious. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. had already entered the palace. If the great prince suddenly became soft-hearted, no one knew what would happen in the morning. Thus, he had set such a reminder and carefully urged him. The great prince smiled self-mockingly and pulled his gaze back from the private residences in the dark night. He turned his head to look at the royal palace shrouded in darkness. He looked for a long time and still did not give the order, because the rear palace was still very calm. When to act is not up to me to decide. The great prince gently patted the heavy city-guarding crossbow under his palm. If we act first, we'll probably startle the people in the palace. Fan Xian will decide when to act. He looked at the quiet depths of the palace and couldn't help but shake his head. He was actually very similar to the city-guarding crossbows on the palace walls. Although they were powerful, their hands and feet were bound by something tangible or intangible. They could only point the tips of the arrows outside the palace, and could not bear to point them inside. The entire royal palace was divided into 3 areas. At the very back was the little building in the cold palace autumn garden. There were no nobles living there. It was basically a forgotten corner. The area surrounded by the walls of the royal palace in Junlin Square was a group of stately buildings, including Taiji Palace. The Qing Emperor and his officials discussed and decided all of the Qing kingdom's matters in these buildings. The place where the nobles lived was behind Taiji Palace. It was made up of countless palaces. Internal guards and internal court eunuchs were responsible for managing and guarding it. It was commonly referred to as the rear palace. Many people thought that once they entered the royal palace, they would be able to smoothly enter the rear palace. They seemed to have forgotten how much the emperor, a different kind of male creature, cared about his territory and his female. The emperors of each dynasty had always kept a close eye on this matter, because they had too many women. No matter how talented they were, it was inevitable that they would be neglected too much. Naturally, they became the most easily cuckolded masters in the world. In order to not be cuckolded, the emperors invented eunuchs. They built high walls in the middle of the rear palace and the front palace, and scattered a large number of guards they trusted. Thus, in history, the perverts who had something to do with the concubines in the rear palace could not escape the 3 types of people: guards, doctors, and eunuchs. Although the high walls of the rear palace could not stop the affairs of the palace from reaching out, they successfully stopped many people who wanted to rebel. History had long proven this point. 100 years ago, during the Wei Kingdom, there was once a civil official who took advantage of the emperor's inspection tour to deliberately plot a rebellion. Like Fan Xian tonight, he only brought 1,000 people to attack the royal palace. Mysteriously, he passed through the imperial army's defenses and was about to succeed. However, the empress, who had been left in the back palace, brought a large group of guards, eunuchs, and serving girls and successfully blocked the rebellious soldiers outside the palace doors. In the end, this daring civil official discovered in despair that the women, and eunuchs were even more powerful than the imperial army. They sealed him outside the palace for 3 days. In the end, this rebel ended up dead. Other than the empress' calmness and bravery, the unity of the eunuchs, serving girls, and guards in the palace that successfully stopped this rebellion. The most important reason was that the high walls the emperor used to keep women were too strong. Where there was a wall, there must be a door, unless it was an underground tomb. Additionally, because humans never liked to crawl in and out of a window opened by God, no matter how tightly guarded a building was, there would always be all kinds of doors. If there was a door, there would be someone who could open it. Thus, determining whether a place was easy to attack or not. The crux was not how thick the door was, or whether the bolt inside was made of steel. Rather, it was whether you had control of the person who opened the door. Mao Zedong and many great people had said that the ultimate truth that determined everything was people. Fan Xian dared to attack the rear palace unexpectedly, because he had control of the person who opened the door. 200 imperial soldiers followed their usual route and carried out a silent and nervous patrol. They moved west on the high walls of the royal palace. Just as they were about to reach the starlight, a cloud suddenly passed by. The starlight gradually dimmed, and the top of the city walls darkened. The imperial soldiers walked down the stone stairs that went back and forth. There was not a speck of light in Taiji Palace. Occasionally, a few guards carrying lanterns and eunuchs responsible for keeping the night watch could be seen walking by with hunched backs. This group of imperial soldiers gathered at the foot of the palace walls closest to the rear palace. Then they scattered like the wind. Fan Xian looked coldly at his subordinates. Like countless eagles, they spread out and pounced toward the remaining people and lights in the front palace. In an instant the lights arrived. A number of guards were silently stabbed to death. He nodded. These 200 people were a mixed force. 100 of the 500 Black Knights had been transferred. The other 100 were the last batch of assassins that had been taken from the 6th Bureau. Working in the dark, they were indeed ruthless and powerful. The deputy commander of the Black Knights, Jing Ge, who was following beside him, glanced at him, and then at the high walls of the rear palace about a dozen feet away. In a low voice he asked, "Attack by force?" Fan Xian's gaze flicked to an inconspicuous door at the bottom of the palace wall. He shook his head and said, "We'll go through the door." "Go through the door." Jing Ge glanced at the commissioner with surprise. He thought, Sir's words were truly wondrous. Had he learned the legendary ability to walk through the walls of the temple during his trip to Dong Mountain? Fan Xian ignored him and took off the heavy imperial army armor on his body, revealing the tight-fitting black nocturnal clothing underneath. Using the cover of the trees in front of the palace, he approached the door. Jing Ge made a hand gesture behind him. The members of the small assault team, scattered in the darkness, immediately flew back like bats. With Fan Xian as the center, they formed two straight lines and stuck closely to the palace wall of the rear palace. Jing Ge also followed and stood 6 feet behind Fan Xian. Raising his head to glance at the wall, he thought that it wasn't too high. At least half of the 200 people could climb over it. The clouds in the sky parted slightly. A bright moon shone through the light clouds. The silver moonlight shone on Jing Ji's silver mask. It was very beautiful. Fan Xian stood in front of the door and gently knocked under the moon. His knuckles landed gently on the heavy wooden door and made a light buzzing sound. There was no reply from behind the wooden door. Immediately after, there was the sound of the door spring moving. The faces of the 200 black-clothed people hiding on either side of Fan Xian involuntarily revealed shock. They had followed Sir Fan Jr. into the royal palace on the previous emperor's posthumous edict. Although these 200 people were courageous and loyal, they had tragically prepared themselves to die. Unexpectedly, Sir Fan Jr. had so gently knocked on the door of the rear palace. In this instant, all of the subordinates who had killed their way into the royal palace immediately felt a boundless respect for Fan Xian in their hearts. Their confidence in the success or failure of the night also multiplied. The wooden door of the rear palace was very thick. It was clear that the traitor inside was struggling to open the door. Fan Xian closed his eyes and pressed his palm against the wooden door. Suddenly he furrowed his brows. Circulating the Jinqi in his body slightly, the gentle Tiani Dao Jinqi traveled along his palm to the door and shook it open about the width of 2 people. Very gently, he opened the door without making a single sound. Fan Xian flashed through the door like a gust of wind. He then glanced at the eunuch behind the door, who was looking at him with a nervous and frightened gaze. He nodded slightly and said, "You've worked hard." Eunuch Dai swallowed and glanced at the dense darkness around him with some fear. He didn't say anything. The eldest princess probably had not thought that there would be someone in the present royal palace who would risk the danger of having his entire family executed to be a traitor to Fan Xian. No one would have thought that this traitor would be Eunuch Dai, who had long lost his former power and was just a normal and pitiful old eunuch. Fan Xian had once done Eunuch Dai a favor, at least 3 times. However, this eunuch was willing to take such a great risk to help Fan Xian, not just to repay the favor. For one, he wanted to help Fan Xian regain the power he had lost and particularly missed. For another, He had a deep connection to Fan Xian these years. If the crown prince truly became emperor, he probably wouldn't even be able to think about his position in the laundry office. He would just be waiting for death. Most importantly, Eunuch Dai knew that his nephew had always been under Fan Xian's surveillance. Eunuch Dai was still counting on his nephew to take care of him when he died. Eunuch Dai looked around in fear. He was actually a bit confused. Why had he opened the door so smoothly? Why had the guards watching all around not noticed him? "Sir, I will lead the way for you." Opening the palace door that was wide enough for 2 people, black-clothed people occasionally floated in. These black-clothed people moved very quickly. In a moment, they had all charged into the rear palace, and each chose a place to hide themselves. Eunuch Dai looked at this scene and felt his heart tremble. He knew that these were the subordinates Sir Fan Jr. was using to cause chaos in the palace. However, it seemed that there were too few people. "Find a place to pretend to be dead," Fan Xian said quietly to Eunuch Dai. The determination in his eyes gradually grew stronger. His familiarity with the geography of the royal palace was something no one could imagine. From the first time he had entered Hongguang Palace to steal the key, he had calculated countless times in his manner about the sudden attack and retreat routes in the palace. Opportunities were always given to those who were prepared. Hearing this, Eunuch Dai quickly bent his body and disappeared into the darkness. Listening to Sir Fan Jr.'s words, he found a place that would not attract attention and pretended to be dead. On this side, the 200 Nightwalkers had already made their final preparations. Fan Xian glanced at Jingge. His thin lips opened slightly and spat out an incomparably cold word. "Attack!" The mission had long been arranged before they entered the palace. He had spies in the palace that no one could guess. He also had all sorts of channels to help Fan Xian understand. He was very clear about the arrangements in the palace. He had divided these 200 people into 4 small groups. The most important were the 2 groups he and Jingge would lead. Fan Xian would lead the 6th Bureau assassins and swordsmen straight into Hongguang Palace. They had to rescue Lady Ning, Igui Pin, and the 3rd prince from the Empress Dowager's personal watch before the people in the palace could react. This was the most important thing. The great prince dared to lead the imperial army in rebellion because he believed Fan Xian could rescue his mother. Fan Xian could not disappoint his brother, who trusted him so much. Jingge mainly led the lone aces of the Black Knights. They had to charge straight for Guangxin Palace with the momentum of a sudden attack, hoping to strike in one blow. Because the eldest princess was in Guangxin Palace, if he didn't kill this woman, Fan Xian would always feel that there was a poisonous snake watching him. Fan Xian had already found out that one and de Bao were in Guangxin Palace. However, he didn't personally go to Guangxin Palace. For one, Hongguang Palace was more important. For another, perhaps he was unconsciously afraid of facing that kind of situation. So he had Jingge lead the army? The 200 black-clothed people were like 200 ghosts. Under the faint moonlight, they split into countless lines and followed the arrowhead as they headed toward various places in the rear palace. Fan Xian headed quickly in the direction of Hongguang Palace. As he passed by flowers, trees, lakes, and pavilions, he met a few guards. 3rd duty armed guards. Fan Xian didn't even glance at the guards standing to the side. He only said in his heart that the guards responsible for patrolling this area were 3rd duty guards. It looked like that little guy hadn't failed. The reason he didn't look at these guards was because the guards along the way could no longer move. Perhaps it was because they had been poisoned or cursed. But the eyes of the guards closest to the palace doors Eunuch Dai had opened spun wildly. They couldn't make a sound. Their entire bodies were stiff. No wonder Eunuch Dai had opened the palace doors for Fan Xian so smoothly. This scene was very strange. The guards responsible for guarding the rear palace looked at the black-clothed people floating in front of their eyes, and were unable to react. With a number of swishing sounds, the last 2 6th Bureau swordsmen in Fan Xian's group pulled out metal drills and cleanly slit the throats of these guards, killing them. It also allowed them to finally escape this nightmarish emotional disturbance. Passing the trees, flowers, lakes, and pavilions, Hongguang Palace was right in front of them. Fan Xian swung his hand, and a hidden crossbow shot out. It nailed to death a night guard eunuch who had discovered him and opened his mouth to scream. Fan Xian needed speed. He needed the feeling of sudden attack and killing that speed brought. He needed this feeling to shock everyone in the palace. Thus, he didn't care if his figure was exposed. The medicine could only be used on a group of guards. It could only ensure that the guards would discover him a bit later. He had never had the extravagant hope that he would lead 200 people into the royal palace and stand in front of the Empress Dowager's bed without a single guard discovering him. It was only a matter of time before he was discovered. Hongguang Palace was less than 300 feet away from this group of assassins in the night, who had shot out like arrows from a bow. Suddenly, a cry of surprise came from a distant place behind him. The sound of a number of weapons clashing rang out. Fan Xian didn't turn his head, but he could tell that it wasn't in the direction of Guangxin Palace. It should be the other two groups of subordinates preparing to find their way into the palace to confuse the guards. His heart tightened. A drop of cold sweat seeped out of his forehead. He knew his whereabouts had finally been discovered. Release, disperse. Fan Xian's figure did not stop. His right hand tightened into a fist, and then quickly dispersed. Seeing this order, the well-trained swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council immediately spread out behind him. Following the curved lake to the side of Hongguang Palace, they turned into countless curved lines. Circling around the path, they used the cover of the trees to head toward the cold and quiet palace. The Overwatch Council swordsman at the very back suddenly stopped his figure. His metal drill pierced into the ground. From his clothes, he took out a small tube. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the bright moon in the sky and pulled forcefully. The fireworks shot straight into the sky. In an instant, it clearly illuminated the quiet and dark royal palace. It also sent the clearest signal to the people hidden in all directions in Jingdo. The concealment had come to an end. They had officially entered the ambush. A knife flew over and sliced into the Overwatch Council swordsman's right shoulder. The swordsman was still holding the fireworks and did not dodge. Fresh blood flowed out. After he gave a muffled grunt, his left hand pulled back the metal drill from the ground and fought with the two guards leaping toward him from the side. Fan Xian was only 30 meters away from Hongguang Palace. He didn't go to see the fireworks. He didn't have time to worry about the life or death of his loyal subordinate. He only stared coldly at Hongguang Palace and discovered there was already movement inside. Involuntarily, his heart gradually grew cold. The reaction speed of the defense in the rear palace was truly much faster than he had estimated. Faster, faster. There seemed to be guards coming to their senses everywhere. Fan Xian was facing Hongguang Palace. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his killing intent was released. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body instantly rose to the limit his meridians could hold. He then stepped onto the stone railing on the side of the palace. The stone railing shattered. Using this powerful counterforce, Fan Xian flew up like a large black bird. Under the moonlight, he used a crude and arrogant posture to descend above Hongguang Palace, revealing his determination. At the highest point, his Jinqi gradually slowed. His body showed signs of falling. He gave a muffled grunt and slammed his right hand down. Using the power of the coffin in the wall, he moved his body a few centimeters to the side and slammed it into the glazed tiles of Hongguang Palace. With one slap, the tiles flew wildly in the moonlight. It gave one the feeling that in this instant, the entire Hongguang Palace was shaking from the slap. No one could match Fan Xian's current speed. No one dared to block such an indomitable aura. Under the moonlight, he used the power of one slap to fly up again. Like a large bird spreading its wings, he landed on the roof of the palace. Then he circulated his qi throughout his body and fell. With a loud crash, he smashed a large hole in Hongguang Palace with all the tyrannical Jinqi in his body. Just as the serving girl in Hongguang Palace lit the first lantern in fear, the black-clothed Fan Xian landed like a stone on the floor in the back of Hongguang Palace. Beside him were shattered tiles and dust. Under his feet was the cracked stone floor that had been stepped on. Chapter 553. The dim light illuminated the side room of Hongguang Palace for the first time. A dim light seeped out from the palace lantern on the table, making the entire room seem a little gloomy. It was even less bright than the moonlight shining through the big hole in the ceiling. The serving girl looked at the dust-covered Fan Xian with a face full of terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. With a hiss, Fan Xian's feet crossed, and he suddenly took 8 steps forward. His sword stabbed out horizontally, hitting the serving girl's throat. Blood sprayed out. Fan Xian's head was slightly lowered. His wrist turned slightly, and the emperor's sword in his hand came out again. It stabbed out strangely from under his armpit, and pointed at a eunuch's throat. He hurriedly retreated another 3 steps. Using the tip of his left foot as a pivot, his entire body began to spin beautifully like a dancer. The emperor's sword in his hand shone with a cold light. Following this spin, it drew out a cold light several feet in front of him. Wherever the cold light passed, the eunuchs and palace maids who were startled awake all fell to the ground in pools of blood. His right foot stomped on the flagstone again, and the flagstone cracked slightly. Fan Xian's body was like a big bird that had been tied up. With a strange posture, he suddenly retreated and crashed fiercely into the chest of someone, breaking all the bones and tendons of that person. He lowered his head, and his right elbow suddenly shot out like a spring. The emperor's sword flew out of his hand and struck the chest of a person who was charging at him from the right. His swordless right fist suddenly punched to the left, knocking the last person to the ground. With a thud, that person did not even have time to react, and fell heavily to the ground. His head was shattered like a watermelon. In the blink of an eye, he had killed 8 people. Fan Xian, who had ruthlessly charged into Hongguang Palace, didn't say a word. In the silence, he attacked with all his strength. The emperor's sword and tyrannical Jinqi made him like a wandering spirit with unparalleled magic power. In a moment, he seized the lives of all the enemies in the room. He didn't let them make a single sound. His sword style was inherited from Sigejian, but it lacked Sigejian's indomitable heavenly killing intent. Instead, it had the shadow's natural coldness. His fist and palm techniques were inherited from the Yi family, but they didn't have Yi Liuyin's carefree and indifferent feeling of floating on the sea. Instead, there was a heroic feeling that came naturally from his tyrannical Jinqi. Who could stop such a killing? Of the people in the side hall, other than those who had died on the ground, only Yi Pin, her son, and Lady Ning remained. Lady Ning had come to see the third prince's injuries, so she did not return to her own quarters. On the contrary, it brought Fan Xian great convenience. None of the 3 nobles could sleep that night. When Fan Xian crashed into the palace like a god, they reacted at the first instant. Separated by a thin veil, they watched Fan Xian's every move nervously. No matter how much confidence they had in Fan Xian, they had not thought that Sir Fan Jr. would use such a violent method to kill off all the internal court personnel watching and protecting him in such a short time. Lifting the curtain, the 3 of them walked down and looked at Fan Xian. The expressions on their faces were all different, but they all had a glimmer of shock. They felt that the Fan Xian in front of them seemed to be different from the Fan Xian before Dong Mountain. Yi Pin's face was full of joy. Since Fan Xian had taken the risk to kill his way into the palace to save her and her son, then the worry she had spoken to Qingping earlier did not exist. Being watched in Hongguang Palace, Yi Pin didn't know when she and her son would die. Suddenly seeing her savior tonight, her state of mind relaxed. She then looked at the room full of dead bodies and broken limbs. Involuntarily, her legs weakened and she wanted to fall down. The third prince, Li Qingping, supported his mother's body and looked at his teacher with a grateful gaze. He nodded his head forcefully. His eyes were already wet. Deep in Hongguang Palace, countless guards had surrounded them from outside. The eunuch aces of the internal court were still present. Fan Xian knew that although his violent attack had successfully made contact with the 3 of them, he had not saved them. It was still a hopeless situation. Thus, he didn't waste any more words with the third prince and Lady Ning. Straightforwardly and coldly he said, "Follow me and charge out." Charging out was easier said than done. Just based on the 200 people Fan Xian had brought into the palace, it was impossible to control the entire rear palace. Furthermore, he didn't know if the internal purge of the imperial army in the royal palace could be resolved before the situation became dangerous. Fan Xian pulled out his long sword from the eunuch's body and glanced at the silent Lady Ning out of the corner of his eye. Seeing the glimmer of a gratified smile on Lady Ning's face, he couldn't help but smile and take out the black dagger from his boot. The third prince's dagger had already been hidden in the thicket by the Qin corridor. Seeing his teacher take out the dagger, he thought it was for him to protect himself. Supporting his mother, he wanted to take a step forward. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian turned the dagger around and handed it to Lady Ning. Lady Ning held the slender black dagger. A heroic spirit immediately surged out of her. After all, she was a female slave who had survived the northern expedition. She had not forgotten the matter of iron and blood these years. Fan Xian didn't look at the three people again. Without wasting a moment, he walked directly toward the door of the side hall. This door did not lead outside the palace. It led to the front hall. If charging out of the palace was not easy, then it was better to charge into the palace. A palm pressed against the wooden door. Without any warning, it was as if the wooden door was made of paper. Pulled by countless powerful forces, it shattered and flew through the air. Before the wood shavings landed, Fan Xian's palm was already glued to a eunuch's palm. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. All of his jinqi surged forward. With just one exchange of palms, he had already felt the power of this eunuch. There were indeed hidden dragons and crouching tigers among the internal court guards. The disciples taught by old eunuch Hong were indeed not to be trifled with. Fresh blood flowed out of the eunuch's five senses. His body was being attacked by the tyrannical jinqi and could not withstand it at all. However, his mission was only to delay Fan Xian for a moment, so that the aces in the front hall and the Empress Dowager could prepare. Fan Xian did not give him the opportunity to delay. Smoke rose between his palms. The poisonous fog headed straight for the face of the highly skilled eunuch. The eunuch's expression changed. Fan Xian's right hand shook. The long sword buzzed and sliced horizontally across his shoulder. This was the difference in power. Under the simultaneous attack of the tyrannical jinqi and poisonous fog, the eunuch had no energy left to react. He could only watch as the light flashed past his eyes. Fan Xian flipped his left wrist and put the emperor's sword into his sleeve. Without another glance at the eunuch ace, he crouched down slightly with both knees and crashed forward like a giant bird flying into the woods. He did not crash into the path where countless aces surged through. Instead, he crashed directly into the wall of the side hall. With a loud crash, he forcefully smashed a large hole in the wall made of wood and brick. Fan Xian did not care about the safety of the three people behind him. He swept directly into the large hole. At this moment, the neck of the eunuch ace standing frozen by the door made a thud and was severed in the middle. His bloody head fell down. Igui Pin and her son stared dumbstruck at this scene. Lady Ning's face was heavy. Holding the black dagger Fan Xian had given her, she led the startled mother and son into the large hole. She guessed why Fan Xian was in such a hurry, and why he had smashed through the large hole to enter the front hall. She also knew that before Fan Xian could control the situation, the safety of these three people completely depended on the dagger in her hand. What was needed for a sudden attack? It was to be as fast as lightning, and as unexpected as wind and thunder on flat ground. Fan Xian's actions tonight carried out this purpose perfectly. From the moment he entered the rear palace to the moment he was discovered by the guards, his and his subordinates' speed suddenly increased. They swept through the rear palace like a wild wind. He stepped onto the stone railing, smashed the golden tiles, fell into the palace and killed everyone. All of this happened in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a piece of flint. If one counted from the first cry of the guards, he had only spent the time of a dozen strikes to successfully kill his way into the core palace of Hongguang Palace. It was truly lightning-like speed. Not only did the enemy not have time to react, but Fan Xian did not even leave himself any time to think or judge. He relied on the intelligence he had gathered about the royal palace over the years, the spies in the palace, and his extraordinarily sensitive intuition to kill his way in. Of course, this action relied on the courage he had lacked the most in the past, the arrogance that came from throwing oneself into the jaws of death. When Fan Xian killed his way into Hongguang Palace at the fastest speed, the 50 or 66th Bureau swordsman, following him also spread out in a fan shape in the darkness and surrounded Hongguang Palace. However, these people had purposely suppressed their speed. At this moment, they just happened to arrive at the outskirts of Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian's calculations were very accurate. Although he had somewhat underestimated the reaction speed of the rear palace guards, these 50 or 66th Bureau swordsmen just happened to block the palace guards, who were rushing over at a very fast speed. The Overwatch Council swordsmen were skilled in killing people in the dark. The palace guards were the elites of the Qing Kingdom's individual martial power. Although they were far from the Tiger Guards Fan Jian had secretly trained for the royal family, their martial power was still very powerful. Outside Hongguang Palace, killing broke out everywhere. In an instant, knives and swords clashed. Countless people were killed and blood sprayed out. In just a few breaths, the circle formed by dozens of black-clothed swordsmen was forced back a considerable distance toward Hongguang Palace. If one looked closely, one could see that these swordsmen's retreat was not passive. Rather, it was an active choice. Although it looked like they were being pushed back step by step by the guards, they had also pulled back the circle and tightly surrounded the main hall of Hongguang Palace. The smaller the defensive circle, the greater the rebound. Many people had already fallen. The black-clothed assassins had blocked the main door of Hongguang Palace. If the people inside wanted to escape, it would be very difficult. Furthermore, it should not be forgotten that Hongguang Palace was not calm at this moment. This was the tactic Fan Xian had drawn up. Surrounded by chaos on all sides and blossoming in the center, the loyal subordinates of the Overwatch Council relied on the darkness to contend with the increasing number of palace guards. In the center of the royal palace, Hongguang Palace, a bright and vicious flower was about to bloom. This flower had to be pinched between Fan Xian's fingers. At the beginning of the chaos in the palace, the guards and internal court aces reacted quickly. However, the nobles in the palace did not have this ability. The old nannies in Hongguang Palace opened their dazed eyes and silently cursed. They didn't know what had happened outside. A little serving girl with nimble legs heard the coughing on the bed and quickly climbed out to help up the mistress of the Qing Kingdom. The Empress Dowager had been having a headache these days. There was a yellow thread tied around her forehead. She leaned tiredly in the arms of a serving girl. A glimmer of confusion flashed through her eyes. The old woman's hearing was not good, so she didn't hear the loud crash when Fan Xian crashed through the roof of the side hall. She also didn't hear the sound of Fan Xian killing 8 people in a flash. This old woman had lived in the palace for many years and had seen countless wild winds and waves. Her immersion in politics and conspiracies immediately alerted her. A cold light flashed through her eyes. She abruptly sat up from the serving girl's arms and shouted in a stern voice, "Close the palace doors. Everyone retreat in." The Empress Dowager's reaction could not be said to be slow. Since she guessed that there was chaos in the palace, the first thing she did was to gather all of her martial power and surround herself. She knew her weight. Since the enemy had entered the palace, she was the first target. Such a reaction was the same as the first time she had heard of her son's death. It was simple and precise. One had to admire it. However, she was destined to be disappointed tonight. Before she could gather her power, someone had already charged into the center of Hongguang Palace. Just as the first clash between the guards outside the palace and the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau rang out, a loud sound suddenly came from the wall behind Hongguang Palace. Bricks and wood flew everywhere, and a hole suddenly appeared. A black figure flew out from this hole, like an azure dragon walking in the night. In an instant, it flew across the sky, heading straight for the Empress Dowager's phoenix bed. The closest distance between the rooms was not the distance between the doors. Rather, it was the wall. 2 rooms appeared to be very far away. Sometimes, they were only separated by a half-foot thick wall. As long as one passed through the wall, the end of the world would be within reach. How many people in this world could be like Fan Xian, able to circulate the tyrannical Jinqi throughout his body, and use the pure heart of Tianyi Dao to protect his heart and meridians, to prevent the tyrannical Jinqi's backlash. Thus, he could turn himself into a large metal hammer and smash through the thick wall. Fan Xian, dressed in black, leaped toward the Empress Dowager with the power of wind and thunder. Along the way, the heir gave out a wretched cry. One could imagine how terrifying his speed had been raised. From the hole in the wall to the bed the Empress Dowager sat on was a distance of 12 meters. On this path, the old nannies and serving girls, who had only brushed against the edge of Fan Xian's clothes, were all knocked to the ground by the tyrannical Jinqi, contained in every part of his body. Their clothes were disheveled, and they were knocked to the ground by blood. The eunuch aces, who had remained in the Empress Dowager's palace, finally moved. For roars rang out. For withered hands grabbed toward the rapidly advancing Fan Xian's body. Like an old tree blooming, they wanted to capture the giant dragon in the forest. Who knew how many years of pure Jinqi could be cultivated in the four withered and old hands? The Empress Dowager sat peacefully in the palace. If she didn't have her own powerful martial power to protect her, how could she use Lady Ning's life to threaten the great prince, who held a large number of troops? After hearing the sound of the wall being torn apart like paper, the Empress Dowager had already turned her head and happened to see this scene. Her gaze was icy and full of confidence. It was as if Fan Xian, who was like a god right now, would become a corpse in the next moment. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Fan Xian did not slow down. However, the aura on his body suddenly disappeared in an instant. It was as if his entire person had suddenly disappeared in midair. His body was still flying, but the tyrannical Jinqi aura on his body had been completely withdrawn. His entire person appeared gentle, calm, and serene. Extremely tyrannical and extremely gentle. These two completely different kinds of Jinqi appeared at the same time on one person's body in an instant. The pupils of the four powerful eunuch aces constricted slightly. They felt shocked in their hearts. In their lives, not only had they never seen, but they had never heard of anyone who could cultivate two kinds of Jinqi that clashed so severely to the peak. Furthermore, these two kinds of Jinqi methods were clearly the best martial arts in the world. Although they were shocked, their hands did not slow down. They also did not lose their confidence. These were the four powerful internal court aces that Eunuch Hong led. They had always thought they were responsible for protecting the Empress Dowager's safety. They thought that no matter how powerful Fan Xian was, he would not be able to ignore the combined attack of the four of them. Fan Xian was not a great grandmaster, but he was the second fastest person in the world. Back then on the meadow, not even the tip of Haitong's sword could pierce through his tumbling body. Now his nature had changed, and he had gradually merged the two kinds of Jinqi. There was only one Wu Zhu in this world. Fan Xian's body suddenly curled up in midair. He raised his left knee and twisted his right shoulder. His body trembled. Unable to borrow any strength in midair, he miraculously turned his body. He trembled for a moment and deviated slightly. The first withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's right shoulder. It was as if it had grabbed a ball of cloud, and did not put any strength into it. The second withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's left arm. It grabbed the blade of the sword he had sinisterly hidden in his sleeve. The blade of the sword tore through the sleeve, and cut a long wound on the palm that contained pure Jinqi, revealing the white bone inside. Fresh blood was stimulated by the Jinqi and sprayed out, drenching half of Fan Xian's body red. The third withered hand grabbed Fan Xian's right knee, and tore off a piece of his clothing. The fourth withered hand missed. It only grabbed one of Fan Xian's shoes. Looking at this scene, a glimmer of coldness flashed through the Empress Dowager's eyes. Before the coldness retreated, a cold light flashed. Like a gust of wind, the sword in Fan Xian's left hand was already resting on the Empress Dowager's neck. Fresh blood dripped down from Fan Xian's torn sleeve, and onto the Empress Dowager's clothes and face. Chapter 554. Inside the main hall of Hongguang Palace, there was a death-like silence. Everyone watched this scene with terrified eyes. Other than the light patter of blood dripping onto the bed, there was not a single sound. Fresh blood slid down Fan Xian's clothes and sword. It followed the Empress Dowager's earlobe, and wet half of the old woman's face, gradually seeping into her clothes. The sword shining with a cold light rested with unusual stability and coldness on the Empress Dowager's neck. This was the first time since the founding of the Qing Kingdom that an assassin had been able to kill his way into the depths of the royal palace, and placed the blade of a sword on the Empress Dowager's neck. Everyone, including the eunuch's aces, was stunned. They watched as Fan Xian held the Empress Dowager hostage and didn't know what to do. All of this happened too quickly. From the time the alarm sounded outside the hall to Fan Xian descending like a god of death, charging straight into the phoenix bed, and controlling the Empress Dowager. Only a few breaths had passed. Earlier in the side hall, Fan Xian had not crashed into the wall. Instead, he had first chosen the wooden door and exchanged a blow with the eunuch ace. He had beheaded him with one strike, successfully making the aces of the internal court turn their attention to the long corridor that led from the side hall to the main hall. However, he had crashed directly into it from behind the wall. Only in such an unexpected and dangerous manner, and forcefully withstanding the attacks of 4 old eunuchs, had he succeeded. To be able to react so quickly and make such a decision in such a short amount of time, it had to be said that Fan Xian's actions tonight were truly valiant. Furthermore, for the people watching this scene in shock, for some reason, a chill rose from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if Fan Xian would pull back his sword at any moment and send the Empress Dowager to her death. Fan Xian's expression was too calm and cold. It was as if the person under his sword was a normal person, and not the Empress Dowager, who could affect the situation of the world. Send an order for the guards outside to stop. The inside of the hall was deathly silent. It served to make the wretched cries of killing outside grow louder. The 6th Bureau swordsmen, who had broken into the palace, were still fighting with the internal guards. After Fan Xian had the Empress Dowager under his sword, he did not hesitate at all. He bent his right knee slightly and carefully hid his body behind the Empress Dowager's back. Flipping his sword around, he rested it on the Empress Dowager's shoulder and moved closer to the Empress Dowager's blood-stained face. His words were very calm, but they carried a power that did not allow anyone to refute him. Everyone felt that if the Empress Dowager did not order the guards outside and the eunuch aces in the hall to stop, Fan Xian might actually take action. However, the Empress Dowager was not an ordinary person. When this Empress Dowager of the Qing Kingdom was still King Cheng, she had experienced many years of precarious days. Her personality was sincere and steady. She was not an ordinary old woman. Later on, she became the Empress and Empress Dowager for decades, living deep in the palace. She had a dignified and powerful confidence in her heart. The Empress Dowager turned her face and looked coldly at Fan Xian. Her white hair was slightly messy, but her eyebrows were furrowed together. She exuded an innate prestige and said in a cold voice, "You treacherous thing! How dare you threaten me?" Her voice was like cutting gold and breaking jade, shaking everyone in the palace. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He had not thought that the Empress Dowager would be in such a wretched state. In such a dangerous situation, she would still be so unyielding. However, he knew that the Empress Dowager had to maintain her aura in order to obtain more benefits in the following matters. Something even more unexpected had yet to come. There was only a slap. The Empress Dowager had turned her hand and slapped Fan Xian across the face. A faint red palm print appeared on Fan Xian's face. The Empress Dowager did not seem to be afraid of the cold blade across her neck. Her eyes, looking at Fan Xian, were full of disdain and disdain. In a cold voice she said, "Do you dare to kill me?" Everyone in Hongguang Palace was shocked. They had not thought that the Empress Dowager would still dare to provoke him so forcefully while being controlled by Fan Xian's blade. Was she not afraid that Fan Xian would actually kill her? Seeing this scene, some of the nannies and serving girls fainted in fear. The Empress Dowager continued to look at Fan Xian coldly and valiantly. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Looking at the Empress Dowager's wrinkled face, he didn't say a word. He knew why this old woman was acting so valiantly. She knew that if Fan Xian wanted to control the royal palace, then he would not dare to kill her right now. Furthermore, she was, after all, the Empress Dowager and Fan Xian's blood-related grandmother. She had predicted that Fan Xian would not act in front of so many people. Even if she was wrong, she still had to maintain her aura. Only then would she have a chance to reverse the situation. Just as the Empress Dowager slapped Fan Xian with unusual forcefulness, a change suddenly occurred in Hongguang Palace. Eunuch Ho, who had been standing quietly at the side of the palace, suddenly floated up. He floated up with unusual speed, but he did not charge toward Fan Xian and the Empress Dowager. Instead, he charged toward the large hole Fan Xian had made. A strange light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes, but he did not leave the Empress Dowager's side. He could only watch as Eunuch Ho and a few other eunuch aces restrained a few people beside the hole. Eunuch Ho's hand gripped the third prince's throat tightly. Igui Pin was restrained by a eunuch. Lady Ning waved her black dagger, but was also surrounded by a few eunuchs. "Little Duke, don't be too rash," Eunuch Ho said respectfully with his hand around the third prince's throat with his head lowered. Fan Xian's hand held the sword with unusual steadiness. Looking at Eunuch Ho, a strange light flashed through his eyes. It was only now that he knew that this second-in-command eunuch ranked below eunuch, Yao also had such a high level of cultivation. The current situation was that Fan Xian controlled the Empress Dowager, while Eunuch Ho and the other eunuchs controlled the three people Fan Xian cared about. How would the situation develop? Everyone was waiting for Fan Xian's decision. The Empress Dowager's expression was cold, but the blood that had seeped into her clothes was slightly cold. It made her fingers tremble slightly. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at the Empress Dowager's fingers. He was not silent for long. He only took a deep breath. All of the eunuch aces became alert. They didn't know what he would do next. Fan Xian raised his face and furrowed his brows. He then raised his right hand and viciously slapped it down toward the Empress Dowager's old face. A crisp slap rang out. This sound was even louder than the slap the Empress Dowager had given Fan Xian earlier. The Empress Dowager covered her face in disbelief. A trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of her lips. The old woman's teeth had probably been knocked loose. Everyone in the hall looked at this scene dumbfounded. It was as if this slap had not only landed on the Empress Dowager's face, but also on their own faces and hearts. Who was the one Fan Xian had slapped? It was the Empress Dowager, the Emperor's birth mother, and Fan Xian's grandmother. Yet Fan Xian dared to slap her. This was a humiliation that could never be erased. Fan Xian had slapped the Empress Dowager. This proved that he had thrown caution to the wind. If he dared to slap you, he dared to kill you. Fan Xian stared at the Empress Dowager's half-swollen face and quietly said, "Let her go. Stop. I don't want to repeat myself a second time." The Empress Dowager was so angry that her entire body trembled. She also felt a glimmer of coldness that came from the depths of the earth. She knew that in the end, she had still underestimated this grandson whose surname was not Li. She had underestimated his coldness and valiant state of mind. She felt the sword on her neck tighten a little more. Perhaps it was only a moment, or perhaps a long time. But the Empress Dowager's gaze finally became a little desolate. She opened her mouth and said, "Do as he wishes. The Empress Dowager will call it personally." "Speak louder," Fan Xian said. The Empress Dowager stared angrily at Fan Xian. She had no choice but to use her old voice to call out to the outside of the hall. "Guards, listen up. All of you stop." For some reason, once the Empress Dowager's edict came out, everyone in the hall let out a breath. Perhaps Fan Xian's behavior had made these people too afraid. They were deathly afraid of witnessing the terrifying scene of a grandson killing his grandmother, and an official killing the Empress Dowager. Only Eunuch Ho, who had his hands around the third prince's throat, furrowed his brows slightly. No one knew what he was thinking. "It looks like Eunuch Ho wants you dead," Fan Xian said coldly to the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager glanced at Eunuch Ho. The four old eunuchs furrowed their brows and took a step toward Eunuch Ho. Eunuch Ho sighed and loosened his grip. The third prince's terror had not yet settled. The wound he had been stabbed by the assassin in the afternoon began to bleed again. He quickly supported his mother and ran behind Fan Xian in a panic with Lady Ning. Once the Empress Dowager's edict came out, the sounds of fighting surrounding Hongguang Palace immediately disappeared without a trace. It was clear that the swordsmen who had followed Fan Xian into the palace had long received instructions. As long as the guards did not attack, they did not take the opportunity to counterattack. All of the large wooden doors in Hongguang Palace were pushed open at the same time. With a creak, the entire palace became transparent. The people inside the hall could clearly see the tense situation outside. They could see the guards holding straight knives surrounding Hongguang Palace, and the countless bodies lying on the empty ground outside the hall. The early autumn night wind also blew in from outside the hall. It was cold and heavy, but it did not allow one to be calm. Following this wind, the smell of fresh blood also entered the hall and rushed straight into everyone's noses. Dozens of black-clothed 6th Bureau swordsmen retreated into Hongguang Palace as quickly as possible and surrounded the eunuchs in the hall. A few powerful old eunuchs of the internal court had no choice but to accept this sullen reality, as they were shackled by the Overwatch Council's special metal fingers. The Empress Dowager was in Fan Xian's hands. Fan Xian had already proven that he dared to kill the Empress Dowager. Under such circumstances, how could these internal court aces resist? Even someone like Eunuch Ho, who wanted to resist, was forced by the situation and could not make too many unnecessary movements. Fan Xian looked at his subordinates covered in wounds. His brows twitched again. With a sweep of his gaze, he knew that although the time of the attack outside Hongguang Palace was very short, there were still a dozen loyal subordinates who had died just like that. It was impossible to break into the royal palace without people dying. To be able to temporarily control Hongguang Palace by paying such a small price was already an impossible mission. Fan Xian lowered his eyes and said to the Empress Dowager under his sword, "You know, I won't kill you. If I only wanted to kill you, I have countless ways to make you die without even knowing how you died." The Empress Dowager coughed violently and held her chest. Her neck had been scraped by Fan Xian's sword, leaving a bloody mark. Seeing this scene, the eunuchs and serving girls loyal to the Empress Dowager revealed terrified expressions. They wanted to go forward and serve her, but they didn't dare to move. The Empress Dowager turned her head and stared at Fan Xian with a venomous gaze. "You are the same as your mother, with wild ambitions. I want to see what you can do holed up in the royal palace." Even if Fan Xian had captured the Empress Dowager and controlled the royal palace, what should he do next? Everyone, including the black-clothed swordsman, stared at him, waiting for his next order. Fan Xian was waiting for news from the other 3 groups in the royal palace. He was also waiting for movement in the royal palace. He knew that success had not completely arrived. If things went wrong, his people would fail on the verge of success. While he was waiting, he did not remain idle. He glanced coldly at Eunuch Ho, who was surrounded by the swordsmen. Eunuch Ho's heart trembled. He secretly circulated his junqi. Fan Xian nodded. Eunuch Ho paled in shock. He flipped his sleeves and prepared to fight. Unexpectedly, when he raised his eyes, he saw a dozen little crossbows flashing with a black light pointed at him. Fan Xian had put a lot of effort into disguising the 200 people he had brought into the palace, because he was afraid of alerting enemies outside the palace. It was impossible for everyone to carry crossbows. Only the dozens of people following him carried 10 hidden crossbows. At this moment, these hidden crossbows were pointed directly at Eunuch Ho. Eunuch Ho roared. His body suddenly rose. But he only rose a foot before his entire body became a porcupine. The 10 crossbow bolts pierced deeply into his body, sucking blood endlessly from his body. With a thud, Eunuch Ho fell to the ground and twitched a few times. He opened his eyes, unwilling to close, and died. Fan Xian looked at this scene coldly. Although he didn't know that Eunuch Ho was the eldest princess' trusted aide, intuition and the scene earlier made him wary. That was why he had suddenly acted and ordered his subordinates to suddenly shoot Eunuch Ho to death. At such a critical moment, Fan Xian was not afraid to kill. He would rather kill wrongly than miss out. Eunuch Ho's death startled the palace into an uproar. The situation, which had just calmed down, became chaotic again. The guards surrounding the palace also became nervous and moved a few steps closer in the direction of Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian did not panic. He slowly removed the sword from the Empress Dowager's neck and swept his gaze across the scene. Wherever his gaze landed, no one dared to look directly at him. They all lowered their heads. He sat down beside the Empress Dowager and lowered his head to circulate his qi. Listening to the clamor in various places in the royal palace, he knew that the 3 groups must have also encountered powerful resistance. Fortunately, His sudden entry into Hongguang Palace had attracted the most eunuch aces, and most of the guards in the rear palace. Jingge and the other two groups should have it a little easier. It was completely silent in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian and the Empress Dowager sat side by side on the bed. The grandfather and grandson were both stained with other people's blood and chilled their hearts. Such a scene of grandfather and grandson calmly sitting next to each other chilled the hearts of all who saw it. The guards outside the palace had not disarmed. Fan Xian did not have extra people to carry out such an important task. All of the black-clothed swordsmen had already returned to the palace. He did not want the situation to change at all. The problem of the internal guards should be handed to him to deal with after the great prince dealt with the problem of the royal palace guards. He only waited. He believed in the strength of his subordinates and the Black Knights. He didn't wait for long. A clamor suddenly arose among the internal guards outside the palace. It seemed that something shocking had happened at the back of the camp. Fan Xian did not rise. He said to the Empress Dowager beside him, "Have them make a path." The Empress Dowager's white hair hung by the side of her blood-stained face. The half of her face that was not blood-stained had been swollen by Fan Xian's heavy slap. She looked unusually wretched. Listening to Fan Xian's words, she glanced outside with her listless eyes and nodded. The head of the guards looked at the situation inside the palace. Gritting his teeth, he opened up a gap in the encirclement. A dozen black-clothed assassins carrying a disheveled concubine walked into Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian looked at the number of people and his heart thumped. He knew that even more people had died in this group. After he saw the glimmer of panic in the concubine's beautiful face, he couldn't help but feel his heart jump. The one who came was Lady Xu, the second prince's birth mother. Ever since the Empress Dowager had decreed that the crown prince had succeeded the throne and the second prince had submitted, the Empress Dowager had sent the crown prince, the empress, the eldest princess, and Lady Xu back to their respective palaces to live. She only left Yi Guipin, her son, and Lady Ning in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian gazed at Lady Xu and smiled warmly. He patted the soft bed beside him and said, "Your Highness, please sit here." Lady Xu had been fond of poetry and books since a young age. Her temperament was light. Usually, her relationship with Fan Xian in the palace was considered good. Because of the second prince's matter, there had not been much animosity between them. She was also a taciturn person, who was wise to protect herself. Fan Xian did not have much ill feelings toward her. However, in the sudden attack on the palace tonight, she was someone he had to control. Lady Xu had been kidnapped by assassins. She had thought she was going to die, but she had guessed who had done such a treasonous thing. Looking at Fan Xian's face, she couldn't help but feel a wave of terror rise in her heart. She couldn't even say the angry words she had prepared earlier. She looked at the Empress Dowager's wretched appearance and felt a chill in her heart. She could only shrink back and sit by Fan Xian's side. The first to be captured was Lady Xu. This was within Fan Xian's expectations. The defenses of the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace were second only to Hongguang Palace. They were also important places. His subordinates would not have been able to succeed so quickly. So when he saw the silver-masked Jingge lead his subordinates into Hongguang Palace with a silent expression, his heart sank. He knew things were troublesome. The matter was indeed troublesome. Jingge lowered his head and said something by Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian's expression grew heavier and heavier. It was as if there was a giant rock weighing thousands of kilograms between his brows, making it difficult to relax. Another subordinate reported back. It was still bad news. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and rubbed them forcefully. It was as if he wanted to chase away the worry in his heart. A moment later, he sighed and quietly said something to the person on the bed. "I had wanted to have a family reunion. Looks like that won't be possible." On the bed sat the Empress Dowager and Lady Xu. Behind him sat Yi Guipin, Lady Ning, and the third prince. Most of the people of the royal family were on this bed. Fan Xian controlled the life and death of the two people beside him, in the most absolute close range, protecting the three people behind him. The so-called family was the emperor's family. Now that the Qing emperor had passed away, other than the 6 people on the bed, there was also the crown prince, the empress, and the eldest princess in Guangxin Palace. Fan Xian unconsciously excluded the gardener, because he felt that King Jing was much cleaner than everyone else in the family. The heavy rocks between Fan Xian's brows were the three members who had not come for the family reunion. The news Jingge and the other group had reported was that the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace were completely empty. For some reason, the eldest princess and the crown prince seemed to have received the news ahead of time. Just a moment before Fan Xian's subordinates killed their way into the palace, they took advantage of the dark night and fled in the direction of the cold palace in the north. Jingge and the hundreds of assassins did not catch up. Such a violent and wanton surprise attack had not captured the most important figures. Fan Xian's mood was unusually heavy, but his expression gradually warmed. Although he had not completely succeeded in breaking into the palace this time, he had, after all, captured the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. There was never anything perfect in this world. He knew that his luck was not good enough to use 200 people to change the course of history. The Empress Dowager sitting by his side suddenly said in an old voice, "I know what you want to do. However, my edict has long been sent down." It was clear that everything Jingge said next to Fan Xian's ear had landed in the Empress Dowager's ears. A glimmer of mockery flashed through her eyes. Looking at Fan Xian, she said, "Chengqian has left the palace with my edict. Tomorrow, the army will enter the capital. Are you afraid? My courage grows every day. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dared to slap your face until it's swollen." Fan Xian looked at the Empress Dowager with a slight smile. The coldness in his words made one shiver. The Empress Dowager's pupils constricted. "The Empress Dowager can have many edicts," Fan Xian said gently to the Empress Dowager. "For example, the 13 city gate guards are still under your control. As long as you send down another edict to close the city gates, how will the Qin family come in? I think you know that the trusted aide the eldest princess placed in the city gate guards was killed by someone I sent last night. I am helping you firmly control the 9 city gates. Of course, my goal is to control you." These words came out of Fan Xian's thin lips. They were particularly gentle and terrifying. The Empress Dowager was so angry that her entire body trembled. She glared at him, but couldn't say a single word. "Although you are already 70 or 80 years old, you are still afraid of death." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the Empress Dowager, as if he was looking at something that annoyed him. "Thus, you will have to send down this edict." The Empress Dowager coughed and glanced at Lady Ning behind her. She then turned her head to stare into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Even if that barbarian helps you, the most you can do is control the royal palace. What can you do outside the palace?" Fan Xian stared back into her eyes and said, "I only brought 200 people into the palace. It's not that I am confident. I left 1,700 people outside the palace. What do you think I can do outside the palace?" Some distance away from Hongguang Palace, at the intersection of the rear palace and the front palace, a loud cry for killing suddenly exploded out, as well as the sound of the palace doors exploding. Fan Xian listened quietly. He knew that the great prince's imperial army had finally arrived. His heart relaxed. He stood and ordered Jingge, "I hand Hongguang Palace to you. No matter who it is, if they make any strange movements, kill them." Jingge accepted the order without any objection. The silver mask on his face shone with a chilling light. Everyone in the palace looked at this person. They didn't know what his identity was for him to accept Fan Xian's seemingly rebellious order so calmly. If it was a normal Overwatch Council official, they would probably feel some fear in their hearts. They didn't know that this deputy commander of the Black Knights had once picked on the eldest son of the Qin family in the military camp. He had stayed in the Qin kingdom's death prison for a long time and suffered countless torments. He had always been a rebellious person, which was why Fan Xian dared to hand him such a rebellious matter. At this moment, Lady Ning suddenly lowered her head and said, "Let me borrow your dagger for a while." Fan Xian glanced at her and smiled. He knew that Lady Ning was afraid that if something truly went wrong, Jingge wouldn't dare to act against the Empress Dowager. She, the Dongyi female prisoner of war, and the child in her belly, who had almost been killed by the Empress Dowager. had been waiting for this opportunity with a fierce and hot-blooded nature. Fan Xian nodded at her, and then walked toward the darkness outside Hongguang Palace. He was going to Guangxin Palace and the Eastern Palace to investigate. He kept feeling that this matter revealed a very strange message. With a clang, he slid the blood-stained sword back into the sword case on his back and walked down the stone steps of Hongguang Palace. The trusted aides of the Qinian unit, who had followed him into the palace, followed 3 steps behind him and also walked down the stone steps. Everyone inside and outside the palace watched him. They didn't know where he was going at such a critical moment. Leading a few subordinates, he calmly walked out of the palace. He walked past the internal guards holding weapons pointed at him, as if they were facing great chaos. He didn't even blink. The guards did not dare make a move. They could only watch as he disappeared into the black clothes outside Hongguang Palace. Although the Empress Dowager was in the palace, Fan Xian's calmness and bravery shocked the hearts of many people. Fan Xian did not purposely suppress the Empress Dowager's arrogance. The words he said earlier were not false. When he and Yin Bingyan had made the plan in the boudoir of Lady Sun Pin of the Jingdo government, he had already calculated how much power he could contact. The secret agents the Overwatch Council could move in the capital, the spies hidden in various manners, and the first bureau Fan Xian controlled, could still move 1,400 people, even excluding the square building monitored by the internal court and the military. Through the Jingdo government, the 500 Black Knights hidden outside Jingdo entered the capital in disguise. Thus, the power Fan Xian could use reached 1,900 people. Furthermore, these 1,900 people were all skilled in working in the dark. Although they were far from a match for the military in terms of martial power, they were a handy weapon when it came to plotting and rebellion. Fan Xian only brought 200 people into the palace tonight. It was not that he was arrogant. For a sudden attack like this, which focused on speed and surprise, the number of people was never the key. Furthermore, he had to leave a large portion of his power outside the palace. The remaining 1,700 people were doing all kinds of work under Yan Bingyun's orders. Jingdo was too big. Fan Xian had to take care of too many things. He handled the outside of the palace himself. Inside the palace, he had to rely on the thousands of imperial soldiers to control the situation. When the cries of killing came from the rear palace, he knew that the Great Prince had already taken control of the Imperial Army. The Imperial Army's actions were just as the Great Prince had said to his trusted officer. The timing of their attack depended on the progress of Fan Xian's advance into the palace. When Fan Xian's brave subordinate stopped his steps in the encirclement of guards and sent out the signal arrow toward the night sky and bright moon, the Imperial Army moved. The signal arrow was bright. In an instant, it lit up half of the royal palace. This kind of signal arrow used to send messages was not the kind the Jingdo garrison and Overwatch Council often used, but it already gave a clear signal. The Great Prince stood beside the city-guarding crossbow and looked at the signal arrow slicing through the night sky. The lines on his face suddenly hardened. Raising his right hand, he chopped down like a knife. It chopped down into the empty night wind at the corner tower of the royal palace. A knife chopped down and directly cut the necks of 2 soldiers on the bed at the same time. Fresh blood sprayed onto the wall with a splash. Unusually bloody, the attack created 2 large flowers of blood. The knife-wielding Imperial Army general who attacked in the night pulled back his long knife and roared, "Kill!" In the dark night, countless people surged into the streets beside the square in front of the royal palace. Silently, they entered the large rooms and began a bloody massacre. A total of 600 Imperial Army soldiers, who had been switched to rest, were still asleep. Many of them had lost their lives just like that. Some of them had been startled awake, but before they could react, they were greeted with merciless sabers and spears. Those who killed, and those who were killed were all fellow soldiers. If this was a different time and place, perhaps they would fight shoulder to shoulder with the Hu people. Drinking hot knives and rubbing their shiny knives, they would bravely kill their way into the enemy camp, blocking arrows and knives for each other. However, tonight was not like that. It was only one side facing the other, an unusually merciless massacre. Before long, The 2,000 imperial soldiers loyal to the great prince had cleaned up a large area in front of the royal palace. Countless corpses and fresh blood mixed together. The stench of blood rose to the sky. The expressions of the imperial soldiers were not good. They were usually part of the Western Expedition Army. This was the first time they had killed their own people. However, they also knew that these people were not on their side. What they had done tonight did not allow them to show the slightest bit of weakness. They had seen the royal seal sent by the commander and the emperor's posthumous edict, so they had hot blood and faith in their hearts. We are on the side of justice. Right now they were still alive. Who could say otherwise? After returning home, I have been writing for 3 consecutive days. I am really tired. Tomorrow, I will write less to rest. As for writing, please rest assured. Of course I am not writing. Cough cough, I am really ashamed. Chapter 555. One arrow pierced through the clouds, and thousands of soldiers and horses came to meet. When that dazzling firework bloomed in Jingdo's silent night sky, although it was only for a moment, it shocked countless people. The internal purge of the imperial army was the first work to begin. Before long, the great prince successfully controlled all of the power. The 3,000 or so imperial army soldiers left in Jingdo became the most powerful military force protecting the royal palace. At the same time, the Overwatch Council subordinates hidden in the darkness also saw this firework. They revealed themselves from the darkness and began to advance toward their respective targets. The Yamen of the Ministry of Justice had always been sinister, particularly on a night like this. In the silence, a wave of hurried footsteps suddenly rang out outside the Ministry of Justice. The bailiffs responsible for the night watch watched the movement outside the Yamen with astonishment. They then discovered with astonishment that a large group of people wearing black official robes were pressing toward the Ministry of Justice. The bailiffs' faces were deathly pale. They immediately sounded the gong to warn the people in the Ministry of Justice, as well as the prison guards at the back of the Ministry of Justice. They immediately retreated toward the Yamen of the Ministry of Justice, because they knew that these black official robes were from the Overwatch Council. They were not a match for them. The sound of the warning rang out. The subordinates of the Ministry of Justice all hurried to the back. Everyone knew that the Ministry of Justice's prison was of the utmost importance. The Crown Prince did not dare to imprison the civil officials who opposed his ascension into the Overwatch Council's prison and had locked them all up there. Although these people were only prisoners in the Ministry of Justice, when they were placed in court, they were officials that even the Empress Dowager had to be wary of. There were not many terrifying sounds of killing. After a few wretched cries and a wave of chaos, the Overwatch Council's 300 or so people entered the depths of the Yamen of the Ministry of Justice and charged into the large square. The bailiffs of the Ministry of Justice and prison guards were surrounded in the center by Overwatch Council officials. The disheveled main official of the Ministry of Justice looked at this scene and couldn't help his heart becoming cold. The two sides had about the same number of people. It seemed that they had the power to fight. However, this minister, who was like the commander of the imperial army, and did not dare to go home, and only guarded the prison in the Ministry of Justice, could not summon any thought of resistance. The black-clothed men held crossbows in their hands. They were the Overwatch Council officials that Qing officials feared the most. The minister knew that since the Overwatch Council dared to act so wildly, Sir Fan Jr. must have begun to stir up a bloody storm inside Jingdo. The remaining power of the Overwatch Council still existed, and Fan Xian's dark name intimidated everyone's hearts. Without the help of the eldest princess power, not many people dared to directly oppose this group. Moreover, he had also heard that a signal arrow had been fired from the palace. Then, he woke up in a panic and clearly heard the heaven-shaking battle cries that soared into the sky from the imperial city. He didn't know that it was the imperial army, but he knew that there was a change in the imperial city. A number of corpses lay scattered on the field. The leading official of the Overwatch Council looked coldly at the surrounded Minister of Justice. Enunciating each word, he said, "I have come by the Empress Dowager's edict and Prince Huqing's military order to bring the old officials out of prison. I would have to trouble you, Minister, to hand them over. Hand them over? No, this was a prison break. The Minister of Justice trembled and didn't dare to speak or curse. Last night, one of his right-hand assistant ministers had died in this hall without anyone knowing. No one knew how the assistant minister had died. The minister didn't want to become a second wronged person. If he surrendered, would he have a chance to live? The light of the torch made the Minister of Justice's expression strange. Seeming to guess his thoughts, the leading Overwatch Council official stared into his eyes and said, "The Empress Dowager has said that all those who have rebelled will be forgiven if they truly repent." The Minister of Justice smiled bitterly. He had even brought up the Empress Dowager's edict. It looked like the Duke of Donbois had already taken control of the royal palace. There was still no news from the eldest princess side. Something had probably gone wrong. With such a situation, why should he bitterly hold on? In a flash, he suddenly thought that if the battle in the royal palace had not been resolved and Fan Xian had not gained the upper hand, if he surrendered so easily, how would he explain it to the crown prince and the eldest princess? The Minister of Justice gritted his teeth. His gaze changed endlessly. The Overwatch Council official looked at him coldly and didn't continue to communicate with him. He slowly raised his right hand. Some of the hundreds of Overwatch Council officials around him raised their crossbows. Some pulled out metal drills. They began to prepare to attack the heavy doors of the Ministry of Justice's prison. On the count of 3, the Overwatch Council official counted expressionlessly. 3, 2, wait! The Minister of Justice was finally crushed by this monotonous count. In a hoarse voice he yelled, "Wait! I want the Duke of Donbois' words." A mocking smile rose to the corners of the Overwatch Council official's lips. In such a dangerous situation, the Minister of Justice's courage had been crushed. He had not become stupid. He knew that the Empress Dowager's edict was only a piece of broken paper. What could truly save his life was the commissioner's will. He took out a document he had prepared a long time ago and tossed it over. The Minister of Justice picked it up from the ground. Using the dim light of the torch, he read the document again and confirmed that it was the decree personally written by Sir Fan Jr. No one knew when this decree had been written or prepared, but it clearly said that the eldest princess and the crown prince had conspired with Dongyi and Northern Qi assassins to assassinate the emperor on Dong Mountain. Each crime was clear. At the back, it said that the governor of the Northern Expedition Camp, Yan Xiaoi, was involved in the rebellion and had been personally executed by Fan Xian. The crime was not important. What the Minister of Justice cared about was the last words. Reading to the end, his expression finally eased a little. In this document, titled "Summon the Imperial Edict to Punish the Traitors," there were about 400 words in total. In the last 100 words, it clearly said that the officials in court had been deceived by Li Chengxian. As long as they repented and performed meritorious deeds for the new throne, the past would be forgiven. The Minister of Justice's hand trembled as he held the decree. This decree did not have the Empress Dowager's seal, but it had the Emperor's royal seal. The most important thing was that Fan Xian had personally made his signature on it. The Minister of Justice knew that at a time like this, no royal seal would be more effective than Fan Xian's signature. Furthermore, he believed that Fan Xian was not someone who would go back on his word. His face grew increasingly pale. He glanced at the Ministry of Justice Yamen guards around him, who were summoning up their courage, but had ashen faces. He lowered his head and knelt in front of the Overwatch Council official. In a wretched voice he said, "I plead guilty." Disarming finger-binding leashing. All of the Ministry of Justice's armed forces were brought under control in a very short amount of time. It was just that this group of people left some face for the minister, except for the official robe and the black gauze that he was not wearing properly. All kinds of knives, spears, and sticks were piled in the corner. All of the officials of the Ministry of Justice had their arms bound behind their backs with special steel finger cuffs made by the Overwatch Council. These finger cuffs were all tied together with sturdy hemp ropes. They were like grasshoppers strung together during a famine. All of these actions appeared particularly familiar and fast. From the day the Overwatch Council Yamen was born, They had used these methods to deal with the various yamens of the Qing kingdom's enormous state apparatus. It could not be said that the Minister of Justice was timid, or the Qing kingdom's yamen were useless. However, it had been many years. The terror of the Overwatch Council had been deeply rooted in the hearts of all Qing officials. Like a natural enemy, the officials faced this group of black-clothed people, could not muster up any courage to resist. After the Qing emperor died and Chen Pingping was poisoned, the Overwatch Council, this terrifying royal secret service, had become the sharpest blade in Fan Xian's hands. While dealing with the remaining affairs of the Ministry of Justice, the two heavy doors of the Ministry of Justice had long been opened. Overwatch Council officials entered and split off many people to help out 40 or 50 wretched-looking officials. These officials did not have time to remove their official robes, but they were already covered in wounds. From this, one could see how hurried and chaotic the Crown Prince had been when he had arrested these officials in Taiji Palace. Many of the officials had no strength to walk after being punished. With the support of these Overwatch Council officials, they were barely able to move out of the door of the Ministry of Justice prison. The eyes of the leading Overwatch Council official narrowed. He quickly walked forward and knelt on one knee in front of these officials. Making a heavy bow, he said in a low voice, "I am the head of the Second Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Morong Yen. On the Empress Dowager's orders, I have come to welcome you. Thank you for your hard work." The civil officials who had been helped out looked at this black-clothed Overwatch Council official and couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. They couldn't say anything. Morong Yen did not rise. Instead, he turned and bowed solemnly to the two leading officials. In a low voice he said, "The commissioner has ordered me to thank the two scholars on his behalf." These two officials were the two first-level officials who had courageously rebelled in Taiji Palace and forcefully stopped the Crown Prince's ascension. They were the heads of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Hu the scholar and Sir Xu Wu. There were still wounds on Xu Wu's face. Looking at this official, he sighed. He did not feel much joy at having escaped. There was only a deep worry for the situation in Jingdo. He knew Fan Xian's personality. Since he had risked his life to break into the prison tonight, the royal palace would certainly be in chaos. The emperor, who knew how many of the emperor's relatives would die in this storm, who the scholar smiled and said, "The Duke of Dombor is wrong. I did not help him. Where is the word thanks?" Morong Yen was surprised by these words. There was no time to explain the situation in the palace in detail. 10 carriages had already arrived outside the Ministry of Justice. They took the injured officials into the carriages and headed toward the royal palace. The situation in Jingdo was still very dangerous. These officials who had just escaped prison could not return to their manners for now. Watching the carriages under the Overwatch Council's protection move along the long street toward the royal palace, Morong Yen, standing outside the door of the Ministry of Justice, finally let out a big breath. Although there were still many things he needed to take care of in the Ministry of Justice yamen behind him, his heart had already calmed down. He was the head registrar of the Second Bureau. Originally, he was responsible for gathering intelligence. In the Overwatch Council incident, he had been given the task of forcefully attacking the Ministry of Justice by Sir Yin Jr. Perhaps he had taken a liking to his calmness. It was not difficult to forcefully attack the Ministry of Justice. What was difficult was to rescue the officials in the prison unharmed. Morong Yin knew this very well. Otherwise, the commissioner would not have given him hundreds of people when Jingdo had so few people. The specific mission had been given by Yin Bingyin, but the requirements had been personally drawn up by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had given a death order to the Ministry of Justice prison. He wanted to ensure the safety of the scholars Hu and Xu, as well as the civil officials. He knew that if these courageous civil officials had not risen up in Taiji Palace and forcefully delayed the Crown Prince's ascension, throwing court politics into chaos and Jingdo into chaos, it would have been difficult for him to find an opportunity to successfully break into the palace. These civil officials, who did not seem to have much power other than opening their mouths to remonstrate, were the true heroes of Fan Xian's mission. Fan Xian had borrowed the bones of these officials, so he had to ensure that their bones were unharmed. This was gratitude and a faint sense of guilt. When the Ministry of Justice prison was opened, the Jingdo government, which had seemed even more difficult to attack, had its main doors wide open and brightly lit. It appeared very strange. The Jingdo government was responsible for Jingdo's security and had many bailiffs and officials under its command. When the signal arrow for the fireworks outside the royal palace rang out, the serious-looking second-level official, the Jingdo magistrate Sun Jingxiu, walked into the main hall with a heavy expression. His subordinates, who didn't understand what had happened, looked at the magistrate with wide eyes and tongues tied. They wondered why Sir Sun was still wearing his official robes so late at night. After a few breaths, the sound of footsteps arrived like thunder. Sun Jingxiu glanced at his subordinates with a complicated expression and sighed with great regret. He ordered his subordinates to open the main doors of the Jingdo government. Once the doors opened, the officials of the Overwatch Council filed in. Under the gazes of the Jingdo government officials, they took up advantageous positions in the main hall and surrounded Sun Jingxiu in the center. The black-robed Overwatch Council officials parted, and a person walked out. It was the head of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, Mu Tai. This steel-faced official looked coldly at Sun Jingxiu and asked, "Sir, you have ordered me to ask you, have you thought it through?" Sun Jingxiu sighed again. After a moment of struggle, his legs seemed to suddenly lose strength. With a bang, he knelt to the ground and said in a low voice, "I know my mistake, but I do not dare to ask for your forgiveness." After this scene appeared, the entire scene burst into an uproar. Everyone felt incomparably shocked. They didn't understand why the magistrate, who had been carrying out the Empress Dowager's edict and desperately trying to capture Fan Xian and Jingdo, would not resist when the Overwatch Council officials arrived and just surrender. Mu Tai's expression remained like steel. It was as if he had not moved, but he was also incomparably shocked in his heart. He had come under orders to stabilize the Jingdo government. He had thought he was going to face the most tragic battle of his life. Unexpectedly, Yin Bingyan had only lightly given him an order and had him come like this. Entering the Jingdo government, he saw the manor filled with light. Mu Tai had thought he had fallen into an ambush. Unexpectedly, the situation was just as Sir Yin Jr. had said. It had gone surprisingly smoothly. Sun Jingxiu knelt on the ground with an unusually pale expression. His left hand held the black gauze in his arms. He thought that he had been forced. Putting aside whether or not the Jingdo government could resist the Overwatch Council, the conversation with the white-clothed man in the front and back gardens had left him with no way out. He could only surrender. It was not until tonight that he learned that Fan Xian had been hiding in his manor for a number of days. The place of the change in Jingdo was in his back garden, in his daughter's room. Of the assassins who broke into the palace, 400 had used the Jingdo government's documents to sneak into Jingdo. As long as this matter was revealed, no matter how he performed tonight, he would not be tolerated by the crown prince or the eldest princess. They would certainly think he was a spy on Fan Xian's side. Thus, he had no other choice. He could only make a difficult decision and completely lean toward Fan Xian. In any case, people would think he was Sir Fan Jr.'s man. So he might as well become Sir Fan Jr. At least he could survive. His future safety, Pinner would probably speak up for him, right? Thinking of this, Sun Jingxiu's blood involuntarily surged. He was so angry he almost fainted. The documents and precautions for the assassins who broke into the palace to enter the capital had all been sent out from his study. Other than Pinner, who else could fake his handwriting and use his official seal without being suspected by his subordinates? In his next life, he would never have a daughter. Daughters would always side with outsiders. The Jingdo magistrate Sun Jingxiu, who had been forced to turn traitor, thought with incomparable sorrow. Not long after the battle in the royal palace ended, a large group of imperial soldiers forced their way into the back of the palace through the front door. In front of thousands of tiger wolf-like soldiers, the already frightened internal court guards and eunuchs wisely chose to surrender. Even if there were some stubborn ones, they became corpses under the sweep of the imperial soldiers. The back of the palace temporarily recovered its silence. One could faintly hear the sound of orderly footsteps and the clatter of armor hitting each other. With a heavy expression, Fan Xian pushed open the main door of the Eastern Palace and left the swordsman who had broken into the palace outside. Looking at the dead bodies along the way, he walked into the palace that had just been repaired. In Hongguang Palace, Fan Xian appeared calm. Only he knew how disappointed he was in the depths of his heart. Not capturing the crown prince and eldest princess was the same as tearing a large hole in his plan. A hole that could never be mended. He looked at the eunuchs and serving girls cowering in a circle. A moment later, he silently lowered his head. It was as if he could hear the sound of horse hooves ringing out outside the distant palace walls. He knew this was an auditory hallucination. However, he believed in the speed of the great prince's army. Since the palace was basically under control, he must have already sent out large groups and begun to advance deeper into Jingdo in an effort to control a larger area. However, he would be careful not to come into contact with the 13 city gate guards and cause trouble. The great prince was like him. Since he had taken action, he would not hold back. The Imperial Army and Overwatch Council were doing their best to track the crown prince and eldest princess in Jingdo. Chapter 556. Seeing Fan Xian walk in with a heavy expression, the soulless Hongju climbed up from the ground and knelt in front of him. He lowered his head and didn't say a word. There was no one else around this room in the Eastern Palace. There was only the standing Fan Xian and kneeling Hongju. The dim light from outside shone in and cast their shadows on the wall. It looked strange. Fan Xian stared at Hongju's soulless face. The hands hanging by his sleeves tightened into fists and then slowly relaxed. Tiredly, he said, "I need an explanation for this matter." Hongju raised his head and glanced at him. His eyes were full of guilt and deep self-blame. However, he only lowered his head again and kowtowed. He didn't explain anything. Hongju was Fan Xian's greatest help in the royal palace. The reason Fan Xian dared to break into the back palace with just 200 people and control Hongguang Palace in one move was because he had a complete grasp of the situation in the back palace, the distribution of the palace guards, and the details of the nobles' lives. All of this was the intelligence Hongju had taken the risk to send outside the palace during these 2 days. This rapidly rising eunuch had originally been moved into Hongguang Palace. After the crown prince returned to the Eastern Palace, he reluctantly asked for it back. Since the Empress Dowager wanted the crown prince to inherit the throne, she would not stop his small request. Thus, Hongju became the strangest person in the royal palace. He had once held memorials in the royal study, served the Empress Dowager in Hongguang Palace, and spent 2 months with the Empress in the Eastern Palace. Strangely, all of the nobles admired and liked him. Fan Xian was no exception. However, no one knew that Hongju was Fan Xian's spy in the palace. The reason the guards on duty on the way from the palace gates to Hongguang Palace were strangely poisoned and unable to give an early warning was all because of this eunuch. Hongju had played a large part in Fan Xian's success in breaking into the palace. However, Fan Xian's gaze as he looked at him was not very gentle. He needed an explanation. The crown prince and empress were in the Eastern Palace, under Hongju's eyes. How could they react to such a thunderous attack on the palace and escape before Fan Xian's sharp sword arrived? Fan Xian's fists tightened. A gloomy voice seeped out from between his teeth. He smiled coldly and said, "Was it you who leaked the information?" Hongju didn't dare look at Fan Xian's cold eyes and nodded his head heavily. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and looked at him in disbelief. "Do you know what you're doing? We are rebelling, not playing house." In order to not let the people in the Eastern Palace hear, he did not raise his voice, but the emotions inside gradually became frantic. "What happened to you? Soft-hearted?" Fan Xian's brows were tightly furrowed. Using an extremely fast and cold voice, he said, "Your soft-heartedness will harm the entire Qing kingdom." He spat on the ground next to his feet and cursed hatefully. "I went through untold hardships to get into the palace, but you played such a trick. It's fine if you don't want to live, but what about the people in the palace? You're forcing me to prepare to run before dawn." Fan Xian felt a rare sense of anger. He could not understand how such a meticulous plan, which mobilized the spies he had spent countless hours and effort hiding in the palace, had, for reasons he could not understand, made such a big mistake. Why? Why? Fan Xian stared at Hong Zhu's face. A dark fire flashed through his eyes. The crown prince treats me very well. Hong Zhu knelt in front of Fan Xian and suddenly began to cry. Tears flowed down from the corners of his eyes and followed along his young face into his clothes. The empress is very pitiful. I thought and thought, but in the end I couldn't resist it. Hong Zhu cried out loud. Snot and tears flowed down his face. Sir, kill me. I don't want to live anymore. I killed Xiao myself. I don't know how many more people I will kill. It's all my fault, my fault. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath. Although he had already cursed earlier, he had not thought that the reason Hong Zhu let the crown prince and empress go was actually because of his soft-heartedness. What happened in Guangxin Palace? I don't know. The corners of Fan Xian's eyes twitched. His heart felt a glimmer of coldness. Looking at the eunuch kneeling in front of him, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, Stand up. Hong Zhu knelt on the ground, not daring to rise. Stand up. Fan Xian roared in a low voice. Hong Zhu timidly stood up, but suddenly felt a pain in his crotch. He couldn't help but cry out in pain. Fan Xian slowly pulled his hand back. There was a complicated emotion on his face. Looking at Hong Zhu, he didn't say a word. A moment later, he only shook his head and sighed. Hong Zhu's face was deathly pale. He looked at Fan Xian with extreme terror. Immediately after, he thought that since he had secretly informed the empress and crown prince to escape before it happened, his life was probably gone. Since things had reached this point, what was there to be afraid of? Thus, he straightened his body and looked at Fan Xian without saying a word. However, the thick sense of guilt in his eyes could not be shaken off. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian didn't say anything. He also didn't take out a sword in a rage to chop off his head. Fan Xian only sighed and waved his hand. Alone, he walked toward the outside of the Eastern Palace. His back appeared somewhat lonely and desolate. Hong Zhu stared in a daze at Fan Xian's back. For some reason, he began to cry again. Fan Xian walked out of the front door of the Eastern Palace. He could no longer hear Hong Zhu's cries. His anger, for no reason, lessened greatly. However, his heart was somewhat empty. He waved his hand to summon his subordinate and ordered him to escort all of the serving girls and eunuchs in the Eastern Palace and Guangxin Palace to the Cold Palace area in the Qin Corridor. Then, he walked alone into the darkness of the royal palace. Hong Zhu's temporary soft-heartedness had brought irreparable damage to his plan. In that instant, the angry Fan Xian indeed had the urge to kill. However, this urge immediately disappeared because he heard the word Xiao. When he was in Hangzhou, he had thought about what kind of effect that serving girl's death would have on Hong Zhu's state of mind. From the beginning, he knew that Hong Zhu was not a normal eunuch. He was a loyal and affectionate eunuch. Otherwise, Fan Xian wouldn't have entrusted so many important matters to him. However, Fan Xian had not thought that Hong Zhu would be so affectionate. How could he be soft-hearted in such an important matter as the change in the palace? From this, it could be seen that the crown prince was a generous and affectionate person. Furthermore, Hong Zhu, who had secrets, had perhaps developed some different feelings for the pitiful empress in the Eastern Palace during the months the crown prince had been banished from Nanzhao. Hong Zhu was an affectionate eunuch and had feelings for Fan Xian. That was why he had taken such a great risk to stir up chaos in the palace and help him enter the palace. He had feelings for the crown prince and for the empress. That was why he had let go at the last moment. Humans had always been complicated creatures, particularly a eunuch like Hong Zhu, who was more like a scholar than a scholar. Perhaps I am too heartless to think that people could be so affectionate, Fan Xian thought to himself. Involuntarily, he thought of Su Maokai of the Jiaozhou Navy. A self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. Su Maokai and Hong Zhu were the two deepest nails he had planted in the Qin court. It was during this world-shaking court chaos that these two nails had their own thoughts and brought great harm to Fan Xian's plan. If it wasn't for Su Maokai, Fan Xian would not have been able to escape from the deep sea under Dong Mountain. If it wasn't for Hong Zhu, Fan Xian wouldn't even have been able to enter the back palace. Thus, he knew he had no right to blame these trusted aides. He couldn't bear to kill Hongzhu and couldn't bear to blame Hongzhu. He only thought helplessly that in terms of moving people with emotions, the Crown Prince had already trained himself to be more powerful than him. The Crown Prince occasionally had true emotions, while he was a hypocrite to the end. With the help of the Overwatch Council subordinates, the Imperial Army had already purged the back palace. The internal guards had all been captured. They shouldn't be able to raise any more waves. Fan Xian returned to Hongguang Palace with a heavy expression. He didn't go in to see the Empress Dowager or comfort the third prince's family. He only gave a few orders in a low voice to Jingge, who was standing guard outside the palace. Jingji's expression changed slightly. It was as if he had not thought that the commissioner would be considering the problem of failure in the midst of such a great victory. However, he didn't ask anything. Stretching out his right palm, he pressed the silver mask on his face tightly and knelt on one knee to accept the order. He then led some of the Black Knight aces out of the palace. The safety control of Hongguang Palace was handed over to the Imperial Army. The two masterminds of the first palace chaos in the history of Qin Kingdom finally met on the tall palace walls about half an hour after the signal arrow shot into the sky. Fan Xian silently bowed to the fully armored Great Prince. The Great Prince's expression was heavy. Although he was wearing armor, he still solemnly returned the bow. The night wind suddenly arrived and made the Great Prince's large red cloak flap loudly in the wind. It made the black Overwatch Council robes on Fan Xian's body stiff, as if they had been washed. The nervous patrolling Imperial soldiers on the palace walls looked at this scene and couldn't help but feel admiration. Suddenly, an indescribable confidence welled up in them. In the first year of the Qin calendar, the Great Prince had led an army on an expedition to the west. His reputation had gradually risen, and he had never tasted defeat. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, he seemed to have become the second Chen Pingping. However, he was much more glamorous than Director Chen. These two princes were like the battle robes on their bodies, a blazing bright red and a cold pure black. With light and darkness working together, how many people in this world could stand up to them? Fan Xian and the Great Prince straightened their bodies and didn't say anything. They came to the outside of the corner tower and watched the calm square at the foot of the tall palace walls. The faint sounds of killing came from the distance, and a few eye-catching fires in the distance. The two of them didn't need to say anything. Accurately speaking, after the Dong Mountain incident, the two of them had never met or spoken. However, they had single-handedly brought about today's palace chaos. This relied on the trust and confidence the two of them had in each other. This kind of tacit understanding was not based on profit. Rather, it was based on history. In the emperor's family, these two princes had both been humiliated and neglected. Their mothers and elders had once fought side by side. Now these two children were finally beginning to fight side by side. Of the 3,000 imperial soldiers, 1,000 were stationed in the palace, 1,000 were on the palace walls, and another 1,000 were already riding toward the depths of Jingdo. They had to take control of all of Jingdo before daybreak. It was indeed too difficult for 1,000 people to take control of Jingdo. If they added on the 1,000 Overwatch Council officials Fan Xian had purposely left outside the palace as helpers, it would go much more smoothly. We have to capture them before daybreak, the Great Prince said coldly. The them, in these words referred to the Crown Prince, his mother, and the eldest princess Li Yunrui. Of the 1,000 imperial soldiers responsible for sweeping through the area, at least 3 small groups of riders were following the route of the laundry and desperately searching for the people who had escaped from the palace. Fan Xian was silent. The moment he learned that the Crown Prince and eldest princess had escaped the palace, he had already given the order. The secret agents and swordsmen of the Overwatch Council were also working hard in Jingdo. However, he knew that just like how it was difficult for the eldest princess to catch him when he was hiding in the vast sea of residences in Jingdo, it would also be difficult for him to catch them. This kind of thing required luck. What was disadvantageous to Fan Xian and the Great Prince was that they only had 6 hours before daybreak. Everything is fine in Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian didn't answer the Great Prince's question. His eyes looked at the soldiers below the palace walls and changed the subject. The Empress Dowager is fine. The Great Prince furrowed his brows and didn't say anything. The Great Prince had always been a rough and generous filial person, so it was impossible for him to do the things that Fan Xian could do. Even hearing the Empress Dowager's name made his mood drop a little. He felt a little uncomfortable. Fan Xian gazed at him with a slight smile. It was as if he could see through the shadow in his heart. He said, "The struggle for imperial power has always been a matter of life and death. We are only carrying out the emperor's posthumous edict. The history books will give you the evaluation you deserve." "I don't care about that." The Great Prince shook his head and faced the night wind high above the palace walls. In a quiet voice he said, "There's no need to say any more. Since Father has given you full authority to handle this matter in the posthumous edict, I believe you can handle it well. I have confidence in you." If he didn't have confidence, the always filial Great Prince would not risk Lady Ning's life and raise an army to rebel. "But can you give me confidence?" Fan Xian looked at the imperial soldiers that appeared sparse compared to the vast royal palace inside. There were only 1,000 soldiers around the royal palace. No matter what, it was not enough to give one a strong psychological support. The Great Prince understood what he was worried about. After a moment of silence, he said, "Father went to Dong Mountain and took away a group of imperial soldiers. Tonight, another group was lost. Don't worry, when used to defend a city, it is always 1 against 3, particularly in a place like the royal palace. 1 against 4 is fine, but the royal palace is very big. It is difficult to take care of it all." Fan Xian lowered his head and calculated. If the eldest princess and crown prince are actually allowed to escape Jingdo and meet with the Jingdo garrison, how many soldiers can the old Qin family move into the capital? 10,000 people of the Jingdo garrison. Since the Great Prince had raised an army, he had calculated the military power inside and outside Jingdo clearly. If we combine our forces, there will be 5,000 people. We should be able to hold them off. My people cannot be used to guard the palace. Fan Xian shook his head and raised his right arm to point at the dark sea of residences in Jingdo. They only have power in there. He turned his head to look at the side of the Great Prince's face and said with slight worry, "You've forgotten one thing. The second prince is not in the palace. He moved quickly and has probably already sneaked out of the city. Do you not need to consider Yi Zhong's subordinates? Furthermore, the army in the old Qin family's hands is not just the Jingdo garrison." The corners of the Great Prince's eyes twitched. If the Yi and Qin families truly joined hands to attack, even if the royal palace suddenly produced another 3,000 imperial soldiers, he would not have much confidence. Furthermore, the royal palace is an isolated palace. It is not like the large counties that have provisions. If the palace is surrounded by an army, how many days can you and I hold out? The Great Prince suddenly turned and stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "What exactly do you want to say? Of course, I know the royal palace is not easy to defend, but why do we have to defend the palace and not the city?" "Defend the city? None of the 13 city gate guards have fallen into our hands. We have no idea which of the 9 city gates will be gently knocked open by the eldest princess, just like how I knocked open the door to the back palace." "Don't hide it from me," the Great Prince said. "You cannot give up on the city gate guards. Your people have already gone to the city gate guards. The spy the eldest princess buried in the city gate guards last night has already been killed by you." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, "The Overwatch Council is not an immortal. It is impossible for them to dig out all of the eldest princess spies. Furthermore, we have to plan for the worst. If the Empress Dowager's edict is unable to subdue Commander Zhang of the city gate guards, you and I have to be prepared to be trapped by the army in the palace. I only want to know how many days it will take for the Qin family's army to enter the capital. Yi Zhong has received the edict to return to Dingzhou. Even if he stops halfway, it will still take some time for him to reach the capital. If we only count the Jingdo garrison, it will arrive in a day," Fan Xian calmly said. "The Qin family's army will arrive in about 4 days. It should be around the time Yi Zhong returns to the capital. The great prince did not ask why Fan Xian understood the Qin family's arrangements so clearly. He believed that the Overwatch Council had spies in the Qin family's army, just like in the Imperial Army. If Fan Xian had not pointed out the targets earlier, the purge earlier would not have been so easy. You can control the city gate guards. The great prince looked into Fan Xian's eyes and suddenly retorted. If you can't, you wouldn't dare to act. Thus, I am very curious as to what considerations you have for saying these things to me now. Fan Xian fell silent. Earlier, Jing Ge brought your council order to me and moved 200 horses. He then left the palace and disappeared. The great prince looked at him coldly and said, "Don't tell me you don't have any thoughts." Fan Xian suddenly smiled and said, "Actually, I wanted to say let's run." A muffled slap rang out. The furious great prince slammed his palm against the bricks of the royal palace. Lowering his voice, he said angrily, "Run? You're crazy." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "I seem to have indeed gone crazy. Where can we run to? I was just joking. Don't get so worked up, all right? What kind of joke is this? Everyone's emotions are so tense. What's there to be afraid of if I joke a little to ease the emotions?" Fan Xian's words were not just a joke. If this had been in the past, perhaps he would have run a long time ago when the situation was reversed for his own safety. This conversation made it very clear that if the crown prince and eldest princess slipped out of Jingdo, the seemingly good situation would be destroyed in an instant. The great prince suddenly sighed and patted his shoulder heavily. "You've never led an army before. You've never seen what a true battlefield is like, so it's not strange for you to have such thoughts." As if to increase Fan Xian's confidence, the great prince said in a low voice, "With your people helping control the city gate guards, even if there are 4,000 people, I can still hold Jingdo for 10 days. Below the royal palace, Overwatch Council officials guarded a row of carriages as they approached the palace gates. The great prince narrowed his eyes and watched as the officials who had been tortured by the crown prince got off the carriages. With this group of officials here, how can we escape? How can we have the heart to escape? Fan Xian was silent and nodded. "Based on what you say, open a court conference today, announce the posthumous edict, and depose the crown prince." The great prince furrowed his brows and said, "Send out orders in all directions and order the 4 armies to return as quickly as possible. The 3 armies are far away on the border and will not be able to return to the capital within 10 days. If you and I send orders to return to the Yanjing camp," Fan Xian's heart chilled slightly, "I'm afraid you and I will become the sinners of the Qing kingdom." Fan Xian was worried about none other than the unfathomable emperor of northern Qi. Information traveled too slowly in this world. Fan Xian knew that he had killed the governor of the northern expedition camp, and the fate of 5,000 soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain was unknown. If the royal palace was in chaos right now, and he used the title of regent to move the army stationed in Yanjing back, it would probably fall into the northern Qi emperor's calculations. He was afraid that before the Yanjing camp could return to the capital in time to suppress the Yi and Qin families, the northern army would move south. After experiencing so many things, Fan Xian knew that the northern Qi emperor was the most powerful figure in the world. Since he had secretly communicated with the eldest princess and participated in the inside story of Dong Mountain, he would not pass up such a great opportunity. Thus the Yanjing camp could not be moved. The great prince's expression also became heavy. He knew that Fan Xian's worry was very reasonable. 10 days, we can only hold out for 10 days at most. If we can't move troops back to the capital to rescue the emperor. He suddenly smiled and looked at Fan Xian. Looks like what you said is reasonable. Our best choice is indeed to escape earlier tonight. After these words were said, Fan Xian paused. Immediately, the two of them met each other's eyes and began to laugh loudly for no reason. The laughter traveled far from the palace walls, startling the scholars Shu and Hu at the palace gates below to raise their heads and look. They could faintly make out that it was the great prince and Fan Xian. The two scholars couldn't help but feel slightly more at ease. They thought that for the two of them to be able to laugh so happily at this moment, it looked like the situation was set. No one knew how much helplessness and bitterness there was in Fan Xian, and the great prince's laughter. However, the two of them, with great tacit understanding, did not bring up the matter of the palace being evacuated again. Since the two of them were already standing on the palace walls, there was no reason for them to continue running. Today, the great unification will be decided. The posthumous edict will be sent to the streets of Jingdo to calm the hearts of the people. The edict will be sent to each province. After the laughter stopped, Fan Xian gazed at the great prince and said with a slight smile, "Use the Empress Dowager's edict to stabilize the city gate guards, and then take control. You said you could stop the army for 10 days. I will give you 10 days. It will definitely last for 10 days. The great prince gripped the sword at his waist tightly. His expression was resolute. He thought to himself, the royal palace will be broken in 10 days. Why does Fan Xian care so much about this time? You must fight for these 10 days for me. Fan Xian coughed gently and took out a pungent pill from his clothes. With a calm expression he said, although I've never been in command of an army, I know that the most important people in an army are the generals of all levels. Think about it. If the commander, deputy general, and colonel all died, what would become of this rebel army? A plate of scattered sand, defeated without attacking. The great prince furrowed his brows slightly and looked at Fan Xian. He thought that if the generals of the rebel army all died mysteriously within 10 days, Jingdo would be able to be held. However, no matter how skilled the Overwatch Council was in assassinations, or how skilled you were in poisons, it would be impossible to accomplish such a heaven-defying thing among thousands of soldiers and horses. Fan Xian did not answer his question. He continued calmly and said, if even the crown prince and eldest princess suddenly died, what reason do you think this rebel army has to exist? The great prince gazed at him with confusion. He wondered if Fan Xian was sick. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, the reason I haven't run and am willing to defend this isolated city with you is not because I have great courage. Rather, it is because I have never lost confidence. However, after this matter, I'm afraid I won't have good days. The great prince didn't understand. Naturally, he didn't know what Fan Xian meant. If Fan Xian truly brought out the heavy killing machine, who knew what path history would take in the future? Suddenly, there was a commotion outside the palace doors. A group of riders arrived in a cloud of dust. It seemed that they had captured someone. The great prince looked over and saw that the person captured was a woman. It was too far away, so he couldn't see her face clearly. However, she seemed to be wearing the clothing of a common serving girl. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and faintly said, our luck has always been good. Look, we've already captured the empress. Are the crown prince and eldest princess far away? After saying this, he turned and walked down the wide stone steps. He prepared to welcome the old officials who had suffered and prepare for the court conference the next day. He wondered what kind of crime he should arrange for the crown prince and eldest princess. At the same time, he prepared to comfort the poor, stupid, and unlucky empress. Should I lock the empress and Hongju together? A strange thought suddenly rose in Fan Xian's heart. He thought to himself that he was actually quite sentimental. Walking on the stone steps, his cough grew more and more severe. It seemed that the pill with the pungent smell of medicine he had eaten earlier had no effect. He leaned against the wall beside the stone steps and calmed his mind. He took out another pill from his clothes and stuffed it into his mouth. He chewed hard a few times and swallowed it. The pungent smell was the smell of ephedra leaves. Ever since Fan Xian and the brothers of the Third Bureau had developed this kind of pill, it was the second time someone had taken it. The medicinal power of this pill was too tyrannical. The ephedra leaves were similar to stimulants. It could easily make one's mind become absent-minded and mess up one's junqi. The first time he had taken this kind of medicine was also Fan Xian. It had been a few years ago beside the precipice of Shi Mountain in northern Qi, when he had faced the combined attack of Lang Tiao and Friar He. Fan Xian panted heavily a few times and calmed his mind. After escaping from Dong Mountain, he had been scratched by Yi Liuyan's sword intent. At the same time, he had been chased for hundreds of li by Yin Xiaoyi. In the end, he had been shot in the side of his heart. His injuries were serious. Unable to receive good treatment, His entire body was at the end of its flight. Although he had rested in Lady Sun's boudoir for a number of days, his present realm was actually only 80% of his peak. In order to break into the palace, he had no choice but to take this harmful medicine again. Only then could he ensure that his valiant strength could be fully demonstrated. The first time he had taken this medicine was for Xiao En, and the secret of the temple in the old man's mouth. The second time he had taken this medicine was for breaking into the palace, and for the great land of the Qin kingdom. There were many things in the world that were more important than health. Fan Xian thought to himself as he walked down with a slightly pale face. Jingdo was in chaos. Compared to the Ministry of Justice and the Jingdo government's victory without a fight, the attack on the eldest princess manor had sunk into a bitter battle from the beginning. The clumps of fire that Fan Xian and the great prince had seen on the palace walls were a vicious plan the Overwatch Council had been forced to use when they attacked. Fortunately, the eldest princess was not in the manor. The chief strategist of Xinjiang, Yuan Hongdao, who was supposed to be in charge of the defense, seemed to have been scared out of his wits by the attack. Thus, after the Overwatch Council paid the price of dozens of bodies, the aces and serving girls in the manor were finally turned into porcupines by crossbow bolts and zombies by poison. The Overwatch Council officials charged in. The leading head of the first bureau, Mu Feng had a deep gash on his left arm. Fresh blood flowed freely, but his face was indifferent. He viciously placed the short sword across Yuan Hongdao's neck. He was Mu Tai's nephew and Fan Xian's direct subordinate in the first bureau. For this kind of life and death struggle, he could not show any mercy. What he found strange was that the eldest princess's strategist, who was under his control, did not show much fear. On the contrary, he was filled with panic. Yuan Hongdao gazed at Mu Feng and anxiously said, "I have something important to report to the Duke of Danbois." Chapter 557. He then said an important question. After combing through the contents of this scroll, he realized that he had made a big mistake and was very ashamed. In the book, the Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, had already left his post when the emperor first attacked the eldest princess. Even if the eldest princess reappointed him after her rebellion, he should not have risen so quickly and appeared in Taiji Palace to speak up for the crown prince. This is a big mistake. I will slowly correct it. I apologize again. Mu Feng narrowed his eyes. He didn't know why this old man in front of him, who looked like a scholar, dared to make such an absurd request. A captured traitor wanted to see his commissioner, even if he was the top strategist in Xinjiang. On such a tense night, he could only be thrown into prison and temporarily keep his life. In his heart, Yuan Hongdao probably knew that he had no way out, so he wanted to use his silver tongue to see Fan Xian and persuade the commissioner to let him live. However, Mu Feng an official of the Overwatch Council, loathed from the bottom of his heart these so-called strategists who only knew how to talk and plot. There were no relevant instructions in the orders he had received. He would not give Yuan Hongdao any more time to struggle. Seeing Yuan Hongdao open his mouth in panic to speak, Mu Feng was increasingly sure of his judgment. It looked like this old man was extremely afraid of death. He furrowed his brows and did not give Yuan Hongdao another chance to speak. He pulled back his short sword and then smashed out with his fist, directly creating a bruise on Yuan Hongdao's temple and knocking him out. Yuan Hongdao only felt a ringing in his head. His vision blurred, and he fainted to the ground. In the instant before he fainted, his heart was filled with anger and helplessness. As the only remaining member of the Overwatch Council's first batch of spies, he knew very well how strict the Overwatch Council's missions were. Since this Overwatch Council official did not know his identity, he would choose such a crude and simple method to shut him up. In the entire world, only 3 people knew that he, the chief strategist of Xinjiang, was a member of the Overwatch Council. One was the emperor, who had already died on Dong Mountain. Another was Director Chen, who was rumored to have been poisoned and was being pursued by the Qin family's army. Another was Yin Ruahai. As for the serving girl who had once met him, she had already died in an accident. Yuan Hongdao was unable to prove his identity. Mufeng strictly followed the rules of the council and did not give him this opportunity. Perhaps this was the common sorrow of the sleuths in the countless worlds from ancient times until now. The possibility of them falling at the hands of their comrades was often greater than them revealing their identities and being silenced by their enemies. He only felt some regret and a strong sense of worry. Mufeng did not know that the person who had fainted in front of him was his senior, nor did he know how much unknown danger his simple punch would bring to Jingdo in the following days. He simply ordered his subordinates to clean up the eldest princess courtyard. He then escorted the remaining captives and locked them into the Overwatch Council's dark prison. Fan Xian took 2 ephedra pills in a row. The powerful medicinal power covered his eyes with a faint and ominous red. However, in the dark of the night, it was difficult to see clearly. He walked to the foot of the palace walls and respectfully welcomed the officials the crown prince had locked up in the Ministry of Justice's prison. He held Xu Wu and Hu the scholar's hands. His thin lips opened slightly, but he was so moved he couldn't say anything. There was no need to fake anything. Fan Xian was indeed moved that the civil officials of the Qing kingdom would stand on his side at such a critical moment. Although he had the emperor's posthumous edict in his hands, and his father-in-law in Wuzhou had, at the most critical moment, finally brought out his most deeply hidden students and old friends in court. He knew how much courage it took to oppose the crown prince's ascension in Taiji Palace. If Li Chengqian was as cold-blooded as him or the second prince, these officials would probably have long become dozens of heroic spirits in the royal palace. Xu Wu and Hu the scholar didn't say anything. They only bowed toward Fan Xian. Xu Wu was the first person in the world to see the posthumous edict. Hu the scholar also knew the contents of the edict. He knew that although Fan Xian did not have the title of regent, he had the reality of regent. The emperor had given the power to choose an heir to the throne to Sir Fan Jr. This kind of trust and entrustment was rarely seen in thousands of years. Time is tight. Fan Xian knew that this was not the time to exchange words of admiration. He faced the officials in the hall and said in an even voice, "I'll have to trouble all of you to rest here for now. In a short while, a royal doctor will come to treat you. Go do your own things, Duke," Hu the scholar said warmly. "At a time like this, we don't have much use. The flag has been waved, and the cry has been made. If those rebels and traitors still do not stop, then the Duke of Danbo will need to wield the emperor's sword and kill them one by one." Although his words were light, his support for Fan Xian was completely clear. Fan Xian said, "I don't know how many other important matters require your support. Presently, the Empress Dowager already knows of the Crown Prince and eldest princess's evil actions. In her heartache, she is sick in bed and has entrusted all the affairs of the court to you two. I hope you two can temporarily endure the pain of your skin and stand well for the Qing kingdom." "I dare not do as you wish," Xu Wu replied in a raspy voice. The dozens of officials behind him also raised their hands. These civil officials knew that the situation in Jingdo was still complicated. They had to hurry and settle the matter. As for the news of the Empress Dowager being sick in bed, these officials unconsciously filtered it out of their minds. No one was stupid, particularly these civil officials. They all knew that Fan Xian planned to use the Empress Dowager to control the various yamens. Presently, he had the previous emperor's posthumous edict in his hands, the Empress Dowager, and the support of various officials. Jingdo, at least on the surface, appeared to be stable. The officials began to rest in a side room in Taiji Palace. Although this place was much better than the prison of the Ministry of Justice, it was still cold and cheerless. The floor was icy and hard. Everyone knew that before the court conference began, it was best for them not to rush to enjoy it. Hu and Xu the scholars followed Fan Xian into the royal study. In this room where the Qing emperor presided over state affairs day after day and examined memorials, the lights were still very bright. In front of these two scholars, Fan Xian no longer needed to hide anything. Worry naturally appeared on his calm face. After some conversation, Hu and Xu the scholars' expressions also became heavy. They had thought that Fan Xian had completely controlled the situation. They had not expected that the crown prince and eldest princess would disappear. Everything will be done according to ancestral precedent, Hu the scholar suddenly said calmly. Amidst the silence, Hu the scholar suddenly opened his mouth and calmly said, no matter what kind of preposterous and shameless things these rebels and traitors will do, presumably, it will not surprise us. Although we cannot immediately end the current chaotic situation, the court conference must begin today. The crimes of the crown prince and eldest princess must be clearly announced to the world. Xu Wu cautiously said, clearly announced to the world? How? How will the court give an explanation to the people? Hu the scholar calmly said, orthodoxy and righteousness are the explanations. If they act in the dark and don't say it clearly, it will not be appropriate. Fan Xian nodded. He thought that Hu the scholar's insistence on immediately calling the court conference, at such a complicated time, was very close to his own thoughts. It was because they didn't know whether or not the crown prince and eldest princess would escape Jingdo, that the people in the palace had to immediately depose the crown prince and smoothly pass down the Qing royal family's great unity. Then they would announce it to the world. After the discussion was set, Hu and Xu the scholars began to personally write letters, sketching out what had happened in Jingdo. Then, Fan Xian solemnly stamped the royal seal the emperor had entrusted to him. He then stamped the Empress Dowager's seal he had taken from Hongguang Palace, and signed his own name. After sealing these dozen letters, Fan Xian handed them to his trusted aide. Through the Overwatch Council's secret mail route, they were sent to the governor's manor of the Qing Kingdom's 7 roads. At the same time, they were sent to the 5 road armies stationed on the border. However, Fan Xian knew that the letter sent to the northern expedition camp in Sangzhou was probably completely useless. When Fan Xian stamped the Empress Dowager's seal, Hu and Xu the scholars met each other's eyes and shook their heads slightly. They thought to themselves that Sir Fan Jr. was not afraid of anything in front of them. He was truly daring. A dozen messengers charged out of the royal palace at the fastest speed, accompanied by the sound of horse hooves. They charged into the streets of Jingdo that seemed to never see daylight. Mingling with the chaotic sounds of killing in all directions, and the sometimes burning and sometimes extinguishing fires, they rode in the direction of the city gates. They carried an important mission on their shoulders. Can they leave the city? Hu the scholar suddenly watched Fan Xian quietly. He wanted to get a confirmation from Fan Xian's mouth as to who was in control of the 13 city gate guards. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, there shouldn't be any problems. My people went at the beginning. Hu the scholar knew that Fan Xian never spoke empty words. Since he had already sent people, he would certainly send the most capable people for important positions like the 13 city gate guards. Fan Xian walked out of the royal study and waved his hand to summon eunuch Dai, who was standing guard outside. After a moment of silence, he said, is there a problem with the empress? The situation in the palace had changed a long time ago. Eunuch Hong and Eunuch Yao had followed the emperor to worship heaven and had probably long died on Dong Mountain. Eunuch Ho had been coldly and mercilessly shot to death by Fan Xian with a crossbow. Hong Zhu, who had enjoyed limitless glory these 2 years, had been imprisoned in the cold palace with the eunuchs and serving girls in the eastern palace. Eunuch Dai had privately opened the palace doors and performed a great service. He was also someone Fan Xian trusted. Naturally, he resumed his position as the head eunuch. Presently, the rear palace was watched by the imperial army. The internal affairs were all handled by eunuch Dai. He bowed and replied respectfully, following your orders, she has already been escorted into the cold palace. The empress's body is fine, but her spirit is a bit weary. Fan Xian nodded. After escaping in the middle of the night, and then being captured, no one would be able to endure such mental torture. The power of the medicine gradually weakened. Fan Xian felt a bit tired. Although he knew it was not time to rest, he still tiredly leaned against the pillar outside the royal study. Looking at the square beside the palace, he was silent and didn't speak. He had not lied to Hu the scholar. It was just as the great prince had said. From the beginning, he could not truly give up on the city gate department. However, he had too few people in Jingdo. There were thousands of soldiers in the city gate department. It was impossible to use such violent methods to resolve it. Thus, he had made a copy of the emperor's posthumous edict and given it to the person he trusted the most. He had confidence in that person and in Commander Zhang of the City Gate Department. Commander Zhang was a true blue royalist. After the Qing emperor was assassinated, he only listened to the Empress Dowager's orders. Thus, he was able to forcefully block the Yi and Qin families' armies outside Jingdou. No matter how he considered it, the City Gate Department should make a choice that suited Fan Xian's interests. Fan Xian didn't know that the pillar he was leaning against had once been the place where the emperor and Chen Pingping had spoken twice. He also didn't know that a person called Yuan Hongdao had already been knocked unconscious by his loyal subordinate and locked up in the Overwatch Council's prison. He was only worried about Wan de Bao and his father in King Jing's manor. He still hadn't received any news. He didn't know if anyone could rescue his wife and brother-in-law, or how dangerous King Jing's manor was right now. When the white-clothed Sir Yin Jr. came out of the back garden of the Jingdou government, Fan Xian's operation to break into the palace had not yet begun. Mu Tai, who was responsible for subduing the Jingdou government, was still lying in ambush in the dark outside the manor. He tidied his white clothes and walked into an alley. He still had a lingering sense of leisure as he turned his head to glance at the night sky. A firework bloomed in the night sky. It was very beautiful. The usually cold Yin Bingyan looked at the firework that disappeared in a flash in the night sky and smiled. He knew that Fan Xian had already made his move, so he had to hurry. He didn't wear night clothes. Instead, he wore an eye-catching white robe that stood out against the darkness around him. His mission at the City Gate Department was not to assassinate. It was to subdue. Yin Bingyan knew how to win the trust of loyal soldiers. Arriving at the City Gate Department Yamen, Yin Bingyan calmly arrived at the Yamen under the escort of dozens of spear-wielding soldiers and waited for Commander Zhang to receive him. Sir Yin is currently a wanted criminal by the court. You are quite daring to come to see me. Commander Zhang of the 13 City Gate Departments, the key figure in controlling the opening and closing of Jingdou's 9 city gates, slowly walked out of the doorway and looked at the white-clothed Yin Bingyan with furrowed brows. Chapter 558. Another blunder. I actually made the link to the fist aura into Evil Ming. Of course, both books were written by the same person. The book number has been corrected. It should be 104-0013. I also don't understand why I would bring up Evil Ming's link. What a head-scratcher. Commander of the 13 City Gate Guards, Zhang Diqing 3rd level. His personnel files were in the Bureau of Military Affairs. His manor was in the south of the city. His servants were chosen by the Overwatch Council. His salary was taken from the internal court. He had never gone to the Bureau of Military Affairs for a meeting. He hadn't even taken a step into the old military yamen. Nominally, he was a soldier. His relationship with the Qing military was like that of a widow and a father-in-law. Even if you beat him to death, he wouldn't dare get too close. His family, colleagues, and the people he socialized with were all people the emperor allowed him to socialize with. The reason for this was because the emperor always kept the keys to the 9 city gates on his belt. Thus, the Qing emperor had to keep his head on his belt. If Zhang Diqing dared to rebel, the emperor had many ways to make him die a tragic death. However, no one thought that Zhang Diqing would rebel. It wasn't just because his family had been loyal for generations. It wasn't just because even his wife was the descendant of generations of loyal officials. Over the years, people had become used to Zhang Diqing's way of doing things. He ate the emperor's food and listened to the emperor's words. Sir Zhang would not wish the emperor wisdom when he ate. He would also not occasionally find an excuse to enter the palace to flatter the emperor. However, he carried out any of the emperor's edicts with unusual firmness, including that night many years ago when Jingdou bled with blood. Counting on one's fingers, Sir Zhang Diqing was like Dingzhou Zizhong. They were both elders who had managed Jingdou for nearly 20 years. For such a person who was as clean as tofu and the sensitive position he managed, no power dared to come into contact with him. Even the second prince, who had once fought with the crown prince for power, did not dare. Coming into contact with Zhang Diqing was the same as touching his father's crotch. Thus, Zhang Diqing was like an invisible person in officialdom. Unless it was a critical moment like this, no one would think of him. After the Qing emperor had died heroically on Dong Mountain, Sir Zhang Diqing's loyalty had quickly and accurately shifted to the Empress Dowager. His figure was revealed in an instant, and it was especially dazzling. He was loyal to the Empress Dowager, not because she was the emperor's birth mother, but because the emperor had announced to the world that the present Qing kingdom was being ruled by the Empress Dowager. These two young officials of the Overwatch Council could guess that the emperor must have other ways to control Zhang Diqing. However, the emperor had already passed, so they had no way to start. They could only proceed from the word of loyalty. Zhang. Fan Zhang Yin said. Yin Zhang, Zhang. Yin. Yin Zhang Diqing was already old, and the bags under his eyes were a little thick. Perhaps it was because he had been worried these days and hadn't had a good rest. At this moment, the pupils above the eye bags were shining with sadness, anger, and many other emotions. In the yamen of the 13 city gate guards, Yin Bingyan arrived alone. After handing over the copy of the posthumous edict, he quietly waited for Zhang Diqing's choice. To be able to copy the Qing Emperor's posthumous edict in such a short amount of time proved that the Overwatch Council's skill level had taken a qualitative leap after successfully forging the old Ming master's will. It also proved that Fan, at this moment, was a revolutionary rebellious spirit that was not afraid of boiling water. It also proved that although Sir Yin Jr. was loyal to the monarch and loved his country, he was not mechanically bureaucratic in the details. The so-called posthumous edict was actually a letter the emperor had written to the Empress Dowager in an indifferent tone that seemed to have seen through the affairs of the world the night Dong Mountain was surrounded. In the letter, he mentioned the matter of dethroning the crown prince, as well as the sinister roles the crown prince and eldest princess played in the siege of Dong Mountain. At the same time, he clearly stated that after Fan Xian returned to Jingdo, the power of regent would be given to him. Furthermore, to everyone's disbelief, he would be given the power to choose the next monarch of the Qing kingdom. 2 lines of tears flowed down from Zhang Diqing's eyes. Although he had long known that the emperor had died on Dong Mountain, seeing the emperor's handwriting, this third-level commander of the city gate guards still couldn't stop the emotions in his heart from surging. Has the Empress Dowager seen this posthumous edict? Zhang Diqing suddenly raised his head and stared into Yin Bingyun's eyes. Sir Yin Jr. was increasingly certain that the plan he and Fan Xian had come up with would succeed. No matter how one looked at it, this commander famed for his loyalty in court would stand on his side. He quietly said, "The Empress has already seen it." Then what about the fireworks and arrows in the palace earlier? Zhang Diqing stared at Yin Bingyun. The posthumous edict orders Sir Fan Jr. to assist the Empress Dowager in getting rid of the rebels. Yin Bingyun was not flustered. As long as Fan Xian's mission to break into the palace was successful, and the crown prince and eldest princess were captured, there was no reason for the city gate guards to have any problems. The fireworks have already begun. I cannot rely on a posthumous edict to believe you, Zhang Diqing said. I want to see the Empress Dowager. Of course. Yin Bingyun's face was icy as he answered cleanly. He actually didn't know the situation in the palace. He didn't know whether the Empress Dowager was dead or alive. But he had to answer confidently. You have been loyal for generations. In this time of danger for the Qing kingdom, you must act according to the previous emperor's posthumous edict. Yin Bingyun did not forget to attach each word to the emperor's posthumous edict. Back in the day, he had traveled around northern Qi under an alias. He was skilled in using money and power. He was also a powerful figure who could deceive people without paying with his life. However, these years, he had only done some desk work in the council and had been away from such dangerous work for too long. Tonight, he had single-handedly convinced the Jingdo magistrate. Now, he had convinced the commanders of the 13 city gate guards amidst a forest of guns. It could only be considered that he had returned to his old profession. There is chaos in the palace, Zhang Diqing said after a moment of silence. I need to enter the palace immediately. Yin Bingyun furrowed his brows. Zhang Diqing's gaze focused as if he had sensed something. Yan Bingyun coldly reprimanded. Sir Zhang, don't forget that the emperor has entrusted these 9 city gates to you. It is your duty to firmly guard the gates for Jingdo. After these words were said, Zhang Diqing fell silent again. It was as if he was considering something. A moment later he said, Sir Yan, give me some time. Delay? Yan Bingyun faintly sensed something strange. Had Zhang Diqing not been convinced by this posthumous edict, and still wanted to see the situation in Jingdo? He didn't know that the eldest princess and crown prince had already escaped the palace. If the 13 city gate guards temporarily remained neutral, it was not a result he could not accept. In fact, it was even better than what he had anticipated. Since he had to delay, then he would delay. Yan Bingyun calmly sat down in the city gate yamen. He sat calmly with a calm expression. Seeing his expression, Zhang Diqing couldn't help but be startled. It was as if he had not expected him to be so confident. However, no one expected that it would drag on for such a long time. Yan Bingyun was under house arrest in the city gate yamen. There was no hot tea to drink, or music to listen to. It was indeed difficult to endure. Of course, the most difficult thing was the omnipresent pressure. He drank the northwest wind, and heard the occasional sound of killing in Jingdo. Sometimes he could even smell a faint burning smell. Someone had probably set something on fire. Zhang Diqing didn't have much time to sit with him. As the commander of the city gate guards, he had too many important things to take care of. He gripped the sword at his waist and walked in the darkness on the city walls. The blisters under his eyes had miraculously disappeared. A light like that of a hawk's flashed through his eyes as he stared at every movement in Jingdo. At the same time, he occasionally sent out orders to suppress his subordinates and strictly forbid them from participating in the coup in Jingdo. He only had 3,000 soldiers watch the 9 Jingdo city gates tightly. In his eyes, the so-called righteous power led by Fan Xian was actually a coup. Although, after reading the posthumous edict, he had to admit that Fan Xian had a righteous reputation, he still unconsciously thought that everyone who attacked the royal palace was a bad person. Compared to Shangjing in northern Qi, Qing Kingdom's Jingdo did not have as much history. However, it had more traces of the military. Although the city walls were not modeled, they were very thick. Although they were not as tall as the royal palace, if they were truly used for defense, the various configurations were much more powerful. Zhang Diqing stood on the city walls. It was as if he was drawing endless power from the thick stone and brick walls, giving him the courage to make certain choices. At a lookout, he stopped and gazed into the distance in the direction of the royal palace. The chaos in Jingdo gradually calmed. It seemed that the Jingdo government had already been subdued by Fan Xian. Bailiffs began to go out into the streets and sound gongs to calm the people. He did not know that the 2 masterminds of the Jingdo Palace rebellion, the Great Prince and Fan Xian, were also standing on the city walls and gazing into the distance in the direction of the city gates. A faint worry flashed through his eyes. If things continued to develop like this, he could only accept the posthumous edict. Perhaps this was not a bad choice. However, Zhang Diqing heard the sound of carriage wheels grinding against the stone road. The sound rang out clearly in his ears. It's the triangular stone road. It's near the city gates. Zhang Diqing was unusually familiar with the area around the city gates. He had managed for nearly 20 years. He was so familiar that he could even tell whether the carriage wheels were grinding over the stone road or the triangular stone road. He was silent for a moment. He then walked down the tall city walls and into the yamen of the city gate department. When the sound of the carriage rang out outside the city gates, Yan Bingyun had already stood up with a heavy expression. The soldiers around him responsible for guarding him became nervous. Pulling out their weapons, they surrounded him in the middle. Yan Bingyun's heart sank, not because he was surrounded by soldiers, but because of the sound of the carriage. In the middle of the night in Jingdo, who would ride a carriage near the city gates? The people of Jingdo had long experienced the court's overthrow. A commotion like the one tonight would not scare them enough to flee. Furthermore, the people were not stupid enough to sit in a carriage and wait to be tortured by the red-eyed soldiers. There was only one kind of person who wanted to leave the capital in a carriage. Zhang Diqing walked in. Looking at Yan Bingyun with a heavy expression, he said, "Excuse me, Sir Yan." He then shouted, "Take down this court criminal." Yan Bingyan's pupils constricted slightly. He didn't know why Zhang Diqing's attitude had changed so drastically. Had Zhang Diqing's mission to break into the palace failed? The soldiers surrounded him. Yan Bingyan did not resist. Everyone knew that the biggest difference between Sir Yan Jr. and Sir Fan Jr. was that his martial prowess was on the lower side. When he attacked, he did not have much killing power. Yan Bingyan would not risk his life. Zhang Diqing only wanted to take him down. If he resisted, and these dozen-long spears pierced into his body, it would not feel good. The City Gate Department did not have the Overwatch Council's steel finger gloves. Instead, they had a small shackle. After it locked onto a person's wrist, it was impossible to struggle free. After Yan Bingyan was tightly bound, Zhang Diqing let out a breath and looked with confusion at the dark night outside. Who would have thought that you would actually come alone? Zhang Diqing's brows were furrowed tightly. I don't know whether to say that Sir Fan Jr. is stupid, or that you are too daring. Yan Bingyan was kicked to the ground and made a rare joke. Actually, this is just a problem of manpower. He paused and then said, I cannot imagine that I would misjudge a person. Zhang Diqing was silent for a moment and then said, the reason is simple. If you win, I will follow the edict. If you lose, what benefit is there for me to follow the edict? Yan Bingyan furrowed his brows and sighed a moment later. A loyal official. How loyal? I am loyal to the emperor, but I will not be loyal to this posthumous edict whose authenticity is unknown. Zhang Diqing's expression was slightly ugly. It was as if he felt a glimmer of fear that he had disobeyed the emperor's posthumous edict. The commander of the City Gate Department thought to himself that if the emperor was still here, he would be a loyal official for a lifetime. However, the emperor was no longer here. Who would want to guard these 9 broken city gates for a lifetime? Yan Bingyan was silent. He had come to the City Gate Department to take a risk, but it was also based on his judgment of Zhang Diqing. He still could not convince himself why such a commander would so cleanly choose to stand against the posthumous edict. Had Fan Xian lost? Yan Bingyan's brows were still furrowed, as if he was thinking of a difficult problem. At this moment, Zhang Diqing was only 3 steps away from him. Yan Bingyan's brows suddenly relaxed. A drop of cold sweat slid down from the corner of his brows. However, Zhang Diqing clearly heard a cracking sound, as if a table leg had been forcibly broken by someone. Yan Bingyan suddenly raised his head and said each word clearly. Commander of the 13 City Gate Guards, Zhang Diqing, has disobeyed the edict and aided in the chaos. All Qing citizens should be punished according to the emperor's posthumous edict. Zhang Diqing's gaze moved slightly. He didn't know who Yan Bingyan's words were meant for. At this moment, the people in the hall were all his trusted aides. No one would be stupid enough to attack. However, he felt a glimmer of strangeness in his heart. Unconsciously, he retreated, wanting to put some distance between him and the tightly bound Yan Bingyan. Someone moved. The person who moved was not Yan Bingyan. Rather, it was one of Zhang Diqing's trusted soldiers. After that person heard Yan Bingyan's words, his face darkened. Gritting his teeth, he raised the knife in his hand and brought it down toward the back of Zhang Diqing's head. Just as was said earlier, no matter how much the Qing emperor trusted Zhang Diqing's loyalty, he would always have spies in the City Gate Department. Most of these spies were sent out by the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian and Yan Bingyan could not come into contact with these spies, but Yan Bingyan was using the posthumous edict to gamble on the hot blood of these spies. Even if it was 1 in 10, it would still be very effective. The wind of the knife came down. Zhang Diqing's face darkened. Without turning his head, he raised his sword and swung it. With a crisp sound, he was forced to take a step forward. The knife of the Overwatch Council secret agent behind him was also blocked. The long spear stabbed forward. In an instant, the secret agent's body was covered in fresh blood and died. Yan Bingyan also moved at this moment. When the drop of cold sweat dripped from his forehead, he had already moved. He gritted his teeth and forcefully snapped his left wrist in the middle. He was not a normal official or general. He was the successor commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Since he dared to come personally to the City Gate Department, he had confidence. The Overwatch Council had studied the tools of the city gate guards very thoroughly. In the end, they had finally discovered the problem with this flail. As long as someone was able to separate the entire wrist joint in a short amount of time and endure the splitting pain, they could pull the wrist out. Yan Bingyun was able to endure the pain and was willing to be ruthless to himself. When Zhang Diqing took a step closer to him, he had already charged up like a cheetah. With the flail in one hand, he viciously smashed it toward Zhang Diqing's head. A glimmer of fear flashed through Zhang Diqing's eyes. Perhaps betraying the emperor had made his state of mind unsteady. He did not dare to take this blow head-on and retreated in a panic. At this moment, the soldiers behind him had stabbed the Overwatch Council's secret agent to death and just happened to block his path of retreat. He could only rush wretchedly toward the door of the hall in an attempt to temporarily avoid this attack. Yan Bingyun floated up and gave chase like a cloud. Along the way, he flipped his wrist and snatched the sword from Zhang Diqing's hand. With a flash of green light, he chopped off the arm of an officer who had come to help. Like a maggot on a bone and a greedy cloud, Yan Bingyun did not fall a single step. He stuck close to Zhang Diqing's body and arrived at the door of the hall. Feeling the dense sword chi behind him, Zhang Diqing was frightened. He had not expected Yan Bingyun to have such delicate and ruthless sword skills. Yan Bingyun was not good at martial arts, but that was when compared to the freak Fan Xian. Once he exploded to kill. How could the most famous spy in the history of the Overwatch Council, Zhang Diqing, who had guarded the city gate for 20 years, stand up to him? The lightning-fast pursuit did not give the soldiers of the city gate guards any chance to react. The two of them had already reached the door of the hall. Bloody wounds appeared on Yan Bingyun's body. If Yan Bingyun had not tried to restrain him to control the city gate guards, he would probably have long lost his life. Suddenly, two rays of sharp chi shot toward Yan Bingyun's body. They were extremely powerful and abrupt. Yan Bingyun gave a muffled grunt and pulled back his sword to protect his chest. Blood seeped out of his nose and mouth. However, the sharp attack finally stopped. Zhang Diqing wretchedly rolled to a stop at someone's feet. It was possible to see the light-colored palace dress hidden under ordinary clothing. The calm eldest princess, Li Yunrui, smiled slightly at Yan Bingyun and said, "Under the protection of two aces of the Juanshang Conference, let me tell Sir Yan Jr. that the reason Diqing betrayed us is because he was originally one of us." A glimmer of disbelief and shock flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes. Shortly after, it turned to dejection. His left hand had been crippled. Standing in the hall of the city gate guards in front of the pool of blood of that brave secret agent, he appeared very lonely. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.